May we please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance?
Where is the flag?
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I don't see. Changed.
Michelle, why don't you lead us off with opening remarks?
Okay. Good evening, Mayor and Council members and village residents. As the chair member of the task force, I would like to recognize past and present task force members. Mayor Derby was our task chair. Council member Brad Moss, during his role as the task force council liaison, did an intensive work and dedication and research at the beginning of this task force, and he spent numerous hours to leading into what we are here today. Thank you, Brad. Our liaison today is Council Member Ignacio Sorora. Thank you. And my task force members are Michael Graffo, Martin Cohen, Billy Kimball, who's not here yet, Don Ellsberg, Servando Parapar, and Fernando Vasquez is not here at this time. The team and panelist members that have assisted us and they're present this evening, thank you all. Josh from Kinley Horn, an associate hired to develop the project master plan. Habib Asaf, okay. He's from Rastelis, hired by council to develop the assessment methodology. Alicia Gonzalez from Media Relation Group for communication and information to residents. John Lurch from Florida Power and Light, thank you. Thomas Bradford, former manager of the town of Palm Beach. Thank you, you were very helpful to us in the meetings. Chris Wallace, the village financial officer, and our attorney, of course, Stephen Hayden.
And Heidi.
Okay, that's true, I forgot, so Heidi, you were with us at the last meeting. The purpose of this workshop is to start fully informing village residents and to provide open communication. This evening is the first well-attended meeting. We have many meetings, but this is what we are here this evening. This is only a workshop. What we want to accomplish with this workshop is to share all aspects of the project for the residents to understand the purpose of the project. What will be the consequences if the project is not done, and the benefits that will be if it's done. A brief history of how we got here. The ordinance creating the Underground Utility Task Force was adopted by Council June 13, 2017. On August 2017, the Council hired Kinley Horn and Associates as consultant to develop the master plan. The task force members were appointed at the first meeting, and the first meeting was held on November 15, 2017. Since then, the task force has held 17 meetings that has been lasted between 3 to 4 hours each. We have had presentation from providers and experts in the fields at all these meetings. Rafteles was hired by council and the previous manager, John Gilbert, on June 27, 2018. Today, we have received a 130-page draft of a master plan, and we have worked long hours to review and provide recommendations, including our village manager was one of her first tasks when he took her position. This master plan that will continue to be reviewed will be submitted to council for final review and approval, even if this council has received a draft. The Underground Utility website prepared by Consultant Media Relation Group was recently launched. The task force is recommending funding of the project by a special assessment because it's more equitable for the funding. We have looked options and we believe in conclusion that that was our recommendation. This evening workshop is to simplify and to better understand the many aspects of the project of this magnitude. And we believe that will be much more effective when it's done by one presenter. Introducing and presenting the project this evening will be our village manager. Andrea has done an outstanding job studying the project and assisting the task force. I believe that we are very fortunate to have a manager with her capacity and energy. The presentation will provide an overview of the project, funding options with different scenarios, summary and understanding the assessment methodology. And at the end, we will have some questions and answers. I believe that at the time that we have the open public comments, if anybody thinks that cannot stay as long as this meeting takes, you are welcome to make the comments, but I think it would be much productive to have some comments and at the end and the questions and answers so you can really see the project and the presentation. That is my recommendation for this evening. And in closing, I would like to request that everybody respect each other. Even if we disagree, I would like to remind everybody again that this is a workshop. All opinions are healthy, and let's take every opinion as constructive and to look into and study for the better result of this project. We should listen to each other, opinion, and respect each other. So with that said, Andrea, as the manager, will be yours. But again, if anybody would like to make any comments right now, are welcome. But I request that we do it after the presentation.
Do you have any opening comments?
So my opening remarks, so as I was thinking about what an opportunity this is, I found myself drawn back to an interview that I did with the Islander in February of 19, and I'm just going to read two or three lines. So we have an engaged and committed council in Key Biscayne. They want to see the village progress. I got that message from them individually and as a group, and I look forward to working with them. And then the reporter says, residents have a lot of ideas and criticisms. They'll bring them to your desk. And my response, I'm truly thankful for that. I open my arms and embrace the criticism. These are the people we are serving. I welcome their insights. I'll listen. I'd rather folks be engaged than not. And then the question said, what about some of these controversial issues? How are you going to handle those when they come up? And I said, we need to make sure residents are engaged in the decision-making process. When people are engaged, they can unite. We can't let folks disengage. So I thank you all for being here, and I appreciate the opportunity for the council and the task force and our panelists and the community to begin the public information piece of this process. So those are my opening remarks. We do have public comments to the chair. If anybody wishes to speak as part of the agenda, you're welcome to speak now. If you want us to get through the presentation and chime in later, we can do that as well. Is there anybody that would like to make any comments?
If we're going to have an opportunity to have public comments right after your presentation, then I'm willing to wait for that. Is that the way?
That's fine.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe if we can hold back from questions and let me get through it, right? Maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A and really drill into some of the issues. You have 20 minutes, Raul? Okay. Okay. So, good evening. Andrea Aga, Village Manager. Thank you again for being here. So, my objective tonight is to help everybody get a better understanding of the work that the village has been doing and what decisions are before you. So, little highlight about what we're going to talk about. I'm going to go over the state of our current infrastructure and some of the resiliency efforts that we're working on now, how the village is energized, how do we get power currently. We're going to look at the undergrounding of utilities, the advantages, the disadvantages, and some of the alternatives that are considered in the master plan. I'll briefly go through the elements of the master plan. Then we'll get to the real difficult questions, I think, tonight with regard to the funding options and some case studies that help illustrate the different funding strategies. And then if we're ready, we have some material that we can present on next steps. So the village's overall objective is to become a resilient community. What does that mean? I think the discussions that we've all been having over the last few, really the last week in particular, has heightened my awareness to some of the really ambitious projects that the village residents and that the council are considering. And the task force wanted to make sure that we can frame the work that they've done in a larger context. This is one example of how resiliency can be defined. Community resilience refers to the ability to adapt to and change conditions and withstand a rapidly recover from disruption due to emergencies. So this was a presidential policy directive. Typically, there's an assessment of risks and vulnerabilities. There's planning and prioritization, which as we get into the CIP process later this year and into the future 5-year capital improvement program, we'll be able to get more into those priorities. We're going to implement, and then you reassess, and then you adapt, and then you go through the cycle. So high level, I just wanted to call out the village's most vulnerable areas. What are the assessed, the risks and the vulnerabilities that we're facing? Stormwater, right? Stormwater infrastructure, flooding, power and communications infrastructure, which is why we're here tonight primarily. Beach erosion, you know, beach renourishment is something that is very important to us and that we're moving along nicely with. Then we plan. So what kind of plans do we have in place? The village has a stormwater master plan that currently has 2 tiers. The first tier was to install backflow preventers throughout the village. That is complete. The next piece of the master plan identifies about $25 million worth of stormwater improvements, the first of which is funded in the fiscal 19 capital budget for design, which is the highest priority area, the K8 pump station. We also have the utility master plan that is coming before you this evening. And for beach renourishment, some of the short-term and longer-term initiatives include grant funding for at least 1 or 2 more cycles of replenishing the sands, and then the longer-term vision, which is to participate in the Federal Shore Protection Program through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So it's important to plan and to act, and I want the community to know that we are aware of these other needs of the infrastructure and the resilience and sea level rise, and we want to incorporate those elements into our plan. But we want to take action as well. And I think part of the energy that we've been moving so quickly, especially since the new year, has been to try to help the task force wrap up some of their work, hand this off to the council so that those decisions can be made on how to proceed. I will point out on March 4th, we are having a workshop with the beach team, so you can come on that date and we can get into more detail on what our plans are to handle that element. And now here we are, starting on the public engagement and outreach of the undergrounding project. So we have hurricanes, right? That's our biggest risk. Why are we talking about this? One thing that the task force made very clear to me was that time is of the essence. And the reason being is that FPL is looking to harden their infrastructure pursuant to a Public Service Commission directive. So they are accountable to that, and therefore the village kind of backs into a timeline as to when certain decisions can be made by the village as to prevent or allow for the hardening to happen. So, real overview on how the village currently gets power. So there is a FPL power plant down at Turkey Point. There are transmission lines that come through the mainland under the Biscayne Bay into the Biscayne Bay power station, the substation. From the substation, there are a series of, but it didn't give me my pictures. There we go. The animation. So there are distribution feeders, which are called out in orange, and then from that there are primary laterals that come out from the feeders. Then at your final point to connection from the lateral, most of these are behind the homes on the residential side, come through and then connect to the actual building, whether it's a single family or multifamily or commercial. So I'll talk a little bit about hardening versus undergrounding and what that process would look like. So in this example, you'll take through the 3 steps. This is in Fernwood. So on Fernwood, this is an example of, you have here our existing street light. You have a concrete pole that has FPL lines providing electricity, as well as AT&T lines and Comcast lines that share the same poles. In a undergrounded situation, the light would remain, the infrastructure would be underground, but you might see throughout towns, there would be some boxes throughout town that we would still see, so not everything would be under town. Alternatively, the hardening basically would take existing concrete poles and create larger concrete poles. So this is what it might look like. And the reason why the existing concrete pole is still there is because the telecommunications providers aren't required to move their lines. So they would have to sort of come along with FPL, and that might be, it's not a sure thing that they would be willing to do that. The other example we provide on West Matheson Drive, where you can see in a residential neighborhood, similar concept. We basically have the infrastructure as it is now, the hard pole with the telecom and the energy. Underground, you'd still have some footprint of an infrastructure, but you lose the large poles and the guiding wires. Compared to what this would look like, concrete becomes larger concrete, and then you have both sets of infrastructure there. So that's why time is of the essence. I did want to point out a couple things that are important. With regard to the hardening project, and we have FPL here who can shed more light on this, but I wanted to make it clear that concrete poles would be replaced for larger concrete poles, and you can see along Crandon and over to West Mashta where those poles are. And then the wood poles, it's only your major lines that would be converted. So you'd have wood poles on the green streets that would become larger wood poles. So we wanted to present a balanced So we wanted to present a balanced picture on what the advantages and disadvantages of the different, maybe we need another battery for this one, or somebody could click through, because this doesn't seem to be, or maybe I'm not pointing it in the right direction. Okay, so here we go. Benefits of undergrounding. So some of the points that we wanted to outline, we have collected some data, and basically 80% reduction in the average number of interruptions per year. The average duration actually decreases. The overhead lines are impacted. I think with Irma, we tried to use an example of what happened with Irma, and 30% of the underground feeders and 4% of the laterals were impacted by Hurricane Irma. We also talk about safety. When the lines are underground, you're less exposed to the electrified wires, and it reduces the potential down power lines and poles in the event of a wind event. And also, obviously, the aesthetics, it removes the overhead lines and poles. It reduces the need for FPL to do the tree trimming in your backyards, as well as frees up some space in your rear yard where there's an existing easement. It'll free up that space for you. The disadvantages of the undergrounding, in fairness, we wanted to paint a fair picture. Because the lines are out of sight, outages generally take longer to diagnose and resolve. So in the event you do have an outage, that's something to consider. The construction disruption within the village doing the undergrounding project will be longer and a bit more intense than the hardening project. The upfront cost is significant. If FPL hardens, and they can speak to what their process is, but the cost to the village is not going to be the price tag that we're looking at for undergrounding. So it's important to note that. And also, we talked a little bit about, even if you're entirely underground, there are going to be some pad-mounted, there's some equipment that's still going to be visible, so not everything is entirely underground. Some questions came up about the methodology and the construction methodology. We could spend days talking about that alone, but I have just high level. With the construction phase undergrounding, you're going to be experiencing directional boring. There might be some elements where you have an open cut trench. You're going to have service installation where there will be workers around and available, and there's also going to be some restoration work that'll come in at the end of the project. When you're looking at a hardening project, you basically have larger equipment. They come in, they'll take out the pole, they'll drop in the bigger pole. The total duration of construction is less, but there is still some disruption. So process timeline. So basically in 2006, the Public Service Commission put a mandate onto FPL to harden by a certain timeline. In 2008, and I think one thing that I learned is that in 2008, we began investigating, but really the 2020 vision, I mean, this discussion has been going on for a lot longer than that, so I'm aware of that. In 2015, the council worked with FPL to get some initial cost estimates. We did a feasibility study. That was a study that was done in 2016. Then in 2017, there was an award to Kimley Horn off a competitive request for qualifications for an engineering firm to produce a master plan, which we are at the tail end of. And then basically, we kind of have, we can either proceed and then commence the program, or we can choose not to proceed, at which point, and FPL can speak to this in a little bit, but their anticipated hardening start would be 2022, and we anticipate that they would be finished with that project closer to 2024. If the project commences, considering the current master plan and the phasing and sequencing, we anticipate completion by 2026. So, master plan is broken up into 12 chapters. So it took me about 2.5 months to study it. It is definitely what I will be using if we go forward as a workbook. It's a guide, it's a manual. What I wanted to point out about the master plan is that they really did a good job in establishing what needs to be considered on a management level as well as on a policy level as we work through this process. So there's an executive summary, which is chapter 1, that kind of high level goes over everything. Project goals calls out the goals specific to their work authorization, not necessarily the larger project at hand. We get into the existing utility system. So you saw some images of how the power is currently happening. There's major data collection that was conducted and that is included in the plan. We looked at zoning and land use. They looked at the topography of the different soils, the geotechnical conditions. We looked at what existing infrastructure we have. Not only did Kimley Horn take the opportunity to meet with utility providers, since I've been here, I've also met with FPL, with AT&T. We're talking to Verizon, to Comcast, to kind of get a sense of have things changed since the initial meetings, and are we really leveraging all of their future plans to align with ours. We looked at some of the existing capital projects and also Miami-Dade County water and sewer plans to address some of the sewer and septic issues throughout the village. I will say next Friday, through the Managers Association, we're meeting with Miami-Dade Water and Sewer. And so one of my questions will be to the county on a county-wide level, how are we going to address the $3 to $4 billion infrastructure issues that they have going on? My gut is that will land at a united effort to go to seek federal funding, because that's beyond the resources that any city in the county has. The report also looks at design criteria and conceptual design. Street lights were considered, where the equipment would be placed. We looked at different levels of right-of-way restoration and what might the level of service that the community is expecting be. We looked at the utility provider guidelines. So there are some textbook guidelines on distances and equipment that was used in developing the design criteria. And one thing that I was particularly excited about was the wireless technology. One of the recommendations is to include some backbone infrastructure to be able to facilitate future wireless and 5G. So the most interesting meeting, I think, or meetings that I'm having is as a government, what is our role in this infrastructure to be able to support the newer technologies like automated vehicles or 5G cellular communications, and what's the next technology after that? The engineers we met with didn't have that answer. They sent us to a different department. So my next meeting is going to be with planning, and I really want to challenge the industry to look far out in advance and make sure we make decisions now that support or even encourage a faster implementation of some of the cooler technologies that are out there. The next chapter gets into phasing and sequencing. There are certain restrictions with regard to the FPL tariff that we had to follow that were considered. There were technical requirements. We looked at different cost efficiencies, traffic impacts, economies of scale. Procurement was looked at pretty heavily. There are 3 or 4 different ways that we could procure that. The advantages and disadvantages are very well articulated in the plan. It was very helpful to me to see that written out. There was some benchmarking against what other communities did. Risk assessments were conducted. We looked at schedule risks, bidding risks, construction risks, budget risks, and there were proposed mitigation strategies that address each of the risks that were identified. Chapter 9 gets into transportation management plan. We looked at traffic volume, what are the current uses and needs of the village, and when might we deploy single lane closures versus shoulder lane closures, and how that would work. So that was contemplated in the transportation management plan. There was a public outreach program, Chapter 10. There was a media that was launched. I hope everybody's had a chance to look at it. If not, we can share that. It's kbunderground.com. There is a media relations group, which is a sub to Kimley Horn as part of the contract that the master plan had to help with getting the word out on what information the community needs and the council needs to be able to make decisions. And timely communication. And the one thing that I added, which is something that's very important to me, as small as we are, is boots on the ground. So my expectation is as we get through the next few phases, you'll see me out and about, you'll see me on the bike, you'll see Jake, you'll see staff kind of getting out there, measuring, taking pictures, making sure that we can really deliver a white glove service in the event that the program proceeds. So kbunderground.com is our website. And the last two chapters to me were the most meaningful. We had the opinion of schedule and the opinion of probable cost. The methodology to determine the schedule I thought made a lot of sense. There were 5 sample areas taken wherein the engineers looked at the different guidelines and applied certain quantities and then extrapolated that village-wide. I think it was a sound methodology, makes a lot of sense. And finally, the overall opinion of probable construction schedule that basically included all of your base costs, the cost to do the undergrounding of the telecommunications and restoration work, and particular projects are in the base OPC, including some streetlight conversions and some things like some other capital program projects that just made sense to align at those phases of the project. My point with the master plan that I really wanted to drive home is that it's a great tool for staff and for the council and the community to help us understand the decisions as we move through the process. But the larger decision at hand before the council is, I think, twofold. One, are we going to proceed or not proceed? And I think the second is the funding structure. How does this program, if we elect to proceed, how is this going to be funded? So with that, I'll walk us. Is Habib here? Not yet. Okay, his colleague. Joe's not here? Okay. So one question that came up at the task force meeting was the opinion of probable costs. There have been some dollar amounts thrown out over time, and we wanted to take the opportunity to kind of show side by side kind of the mapping and what was included and what wasn't included. So if in your mind the $13 million amount resonated with you, that included the FPL conversion and their direct costs. It included the GAF waiver, which is a credit that the village would get for pursuing this project. So it gave you a hard cost subtotal for just that. Fast forward, there was a feasibility study that we had talked briefly about that included a price tag of about $30 million. So that was a bit more comprehensive. It included the FPL conversion costs, their direct costs, the FPL services. It also included the other telecom converting over and gave you a hard cost to that amount. What it didn't include was some of the engineering, the permitting, and the surveying, some of the other soft costs. And it did include a 10% contingency, which got us to the $30 million. And then finally, where we are now, you can see that we've added the street lighting, we've added an allocation for the restoration. There's some construction management costs, and there's some public outreach that when we get to that point, depending on the procurement methodology and how we proceed, I'll study those available resources and we can kind of figure out what the best approach is. But we wanted to show over time the evolution of those opinions of probable cost. So in essence, the two primary funding strategies that were contemplated by the task force was the special assessment approach and the GOB, which is the general obligation bond. So high level, the debt issuance through a GOB requires approval of the qualified electors, of the registered voters. The financial burden is based on the taxable value of your property and is subject to the village's debt cap. The special assessment approach requires approval of property owners. The financial burden is based on the relative benefits to each of the properties, and it is not subject to the village's debt cap. Over the last few weeks, based on the feedback, the conversations I've been having with staff members, with council, with task force, with the community, we've started looking at other hybrid and alternatives, some combination of the two, if there are other revenue sources like franchise fees that we can pledge to be able to leverage those. So there are some analyses that we're working on in the long run that might create some other hybrid approaches with the funding strategy. So I guess do we have an ETA of when Habib will get here? 7. Okay. So I'll keep going. So project funding, financing scenarios. So it's a little complicated, but I'll highlight a couple points. What we wanted to do was basically show a scenario where we run a debt for 30 years versus 20 years. And when we run two different bond issuances, one which is a fixed millage, ascending debt service, and one with a fixed millage, I think those are ascending, and one with level debt. So there's really 3 things I want to point out here. The first thing, when you look at the different financing options with regard to issuing debt, the first point I want to call out is what the average debt service. Where do I? So basically the average annual debt service. I want to point out that across the different scenarios, and there would be different interest rates, but there are certain things for apples to apples comparisons that we kept flat. So the annual debt service, basically in any given scenario, so what is the obligation on the village in any given year, ranges from about $3 million to almost $4 million. So that's the debt service obligation. With regard to the total cost, so when you go buy a house, one of the reasons why you say 20 or 30 years is that over the life of the debt, how much am I actually paying for this? So I wanted to highlight that depending on the different options and timeframes, you could be looking at anywhere between 75 million upwards of 100 million. And then I said, okay, well, what does that convert to with regard to millage? And depending on the different structures, in essence, what you're looking at on an annual basis is a millage increase of 0.26 to about 0.36. So that's kind of the range to give you a sense of, and if you take your taxable value, divide by 1,000, multiply by that rate, you can start to get a sense of what a millage impact would be to your home if we were to go through the GOB assessment. We have a couple examples here. So basically, if your home is priced at your taxable value, we took 500,000, a million, 3 million, 5 million. Our current adopted millage rate is 3.1. If we use the debt service, the voted debt service of 0.26, if your current bill, let's just take the $500,000 example, you were paying $1,550 just in village taxes. This excludes school board, library, everybody else. Your new bill would be $1,680, so you're looking at an impact of about $130 for every $500,000 increment of value. So just to jump up to the higher scale for the $5 million home, same assumptions, your increase basically annually would be about $1,305, more or less. And we run through the different scenarios, assuming the 0.26. If on the high end of the spectrum at the 0.35, you're looking at an annual increase anywhere from $179 to about $1,700, depending on the value of your home. And then we also wanted to run the scenario at the highest potential, which is the 0.3656, which, as you can see, the range based on the value of your home is anywhere from $180 to about $1,800. So hopefully that can put that into context. So at this point, we have the consultant is flying in and is not here yet to give his piece of the presentation. So we can do a couple things. Yeah, so basically so at that point, the game plan was I was going to turn it over to the consultant who did the fee assessment methodology to basically work the ABCs of special assessment, what the work that he and his team have done, and how that pans out. And then we were going to turn it over to the panel to basically take any questions that the council and the task force members and the community have. Hold on. Is it on? Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Alicia Gonzalez. I just wanted to add, because I see some of you taking pictures, and I want to relieve you of concern. This presentation and the draft master plan are up right now on the village website, and you can, on the KB Underground website, and you can download all of it, both the draft master plan and this presentation as well. And anything else that we gather tonight, we will gladly put up as well.
Thank you.
Can we ask Tom to give us a little brief scenario of what you went through in West Palm Beach?
Sure.
Thank you.
Can we have, when we, is this a council meeting or underground?
It is a council
Okay,
meeting.
let me ask you, may I, before I, Mr.
Hello?
My apologies. By the way, as a comment, a consultant who can't get here on time, it's an unfortunate thing. I wanted to spend as much time as a councilman, since the process, obviously, is one that will lead to the council, that would then make a decision arising out of all of the other previous councilmen's hard work and the extraordinary work of this utility task force. And then it goes to the voters, so that people understand that. Is that a correct outline? Then I see that because I think people that are here and those who are watching need to know the process, the big picture. Because I have said in 2 meetings before of the task force that I've been a guest, that some of the information, including the pictures, are slightly misleading, and it's unnecessary, and it confuses people. You know, like the poles are in the front, the ones that, again, were used today, when most of the poles that are hardened are in the back. And also that there be an objective and non-promotional kind of undertaking to our website and our presentations, because the council has yet to decide. So for the 4th time, I hope that the communications people make sure that the information that is being put to the voters and taxpayers is objective and clear and not in any way biased, unintentionally biased, but it is something that I'm getting a lot of feedback from. It's like it's a foregone conclusion that we're going to do this, and that is not a good, healthy beginning of communication.
Whoever's controlling the slides, can we jump to the slide that shows which lines are going to be hardened? Because that was something I learned recently too, Councilman, that not every pole in your backyard would be hardened. So it's actually only the poles on the major thoroughfares that would be hardened. And perhaps, if I may allow FPL to speak to that. Thank you.
Yeah, John Lair, FPL. The current hardening program that we have today is the overhead hardening program that was established back in probably 2005, 2006. And it pertains only to the feeders. Those are the 3-phase circuits that typically they're in the front of the homes. There are probably a few rear of feeders. However, if those poles are replaced, they will be replaced with wood poles, so we can still access them and climb them. So typically when we harden, the pole's 5 foot taller, space-wise, but it is larger at the circumference at the bottom, at the base.
And the distance between them?
That's all dependent on the load. That's whether we're the only ones on the pole or whether AT&T or Comcast are on there. They add more of a load to those poles. And so in some cases, if we can beef the pole up, we will. But if it's cheaper to put more poles in at less spacing, that's what we would do.
So is it fair for me, because I'm trying to learn from the professionals, it's the hardening that we're talking about, which is now one of my questions finally been answered. 2022 is your commencement date, right?
Well,
Those are that are in the front of the properties, and those who are in the rear that are wooden will remain the same?
the ones down here, Crandon Boulevard, okay? Yeah, those are the feeders. Well, I think there's actually more feeder than just the pink.
But my question is one,
very specific. I did serve on the Public Service Commission.
Okay.
As it relates to Joe Smith,
Mhm.
who has a property, a residential property, the so-called hardening,
Mhm.
does it or does it not entail the pole that is in the rear of their house?
If we have a feeder circuit, and I think there are feeders that go rear of, okay? Feeder is the three phases that
I know
go,
what a
just like,
feeder is, but
just like Crandon. Those poles will be hardened also, but they'll be wood poles.
I'm trying to get a sense, Mr. Lair, of how many people's residents, except those relatively few, and correct me when I'm wrong, because I'm not, that have the feeder situation, their property will be impacted by hardening.
We provided a ballpark estimate like the Public Services Commission requires. I didn't do I haven't walked the site to see what feeders are behind homes and what feeders are in front of homes.
One last attempt. The non-feeder poles
Correct, the
that
non-feeder
are now
poles.
wood, that are in the rear of the properties, will they or will they not be impacted by the hardening program of FPNL?
In the current hardening program, they won't be impacted.
They will not be impacted. Thank you.
Correct.
John, a quick question. As it relates, and I'm not sure if this question was asked or was answered, but as it relates to the hardened poles, do you know what rating capacity they have from a standpoint of a hurricane? Is it a Cat 3, a Cat 4? What's the exposure for those property owners right there?
Our design standard is for 145 mile an hour wind.
What is that specifically?
That's,
A Cat 5,
I
right?
guess that's a Cat 5.
Yeah.
Okay.
I thought Cat 5 was like 155 or what? Yeah.
So it probably would say between a Cat, the scale is it's changing right now, and obviously hurricanes have become much stronger as we've seen in Irma and Puerto Rico. So, I mean, we can't really say that, a Cat 5, those poles would be able to withstand, God forbid, but let's say even a Cat 3. Is there still, I'm not considering to be a hurricane expert on this, but I think it's a question that merits to be answered from that perspective. What is the risk that the community has on one of those poles, coming down? And when they do come down, that'll be.
The design of those poles from the overhead perspective is, our stance would be the pole would remain, but the lines themselves would come down, and we would have to go back up and replace the insulators to put the wires back up.
So up to a Cat 4, we would be okay.
Again, our design standards are 145 mile an hour wind. So whether your category 4 is at the top of the limit or at the bottom of the limit.
Okay, I just want to make sure that everybody, lately hurricanes have been pretty harsh, so.
Mr. Mayor, may I don't know, can anybody hear me? Yes. It's unfortunate that our assessment consultant is not here, but I think it affords us tonight an opportunity to do what is very important here, which is to bifurcate what's going on. There were two tasks of this task force. The first one was to review the Kimley Horn 138 pages as it built with us and all of that to make a determination, is this project worthwhile? And I think that the task force, they can all speak for themselves, was very clear at the end of that process that they thought this was a clear recommendation to the village council to proceed. The second piece, which is really in a way independent of that first decision, was if you're going to go, how do you pay for it? And as it turns out, and as the village manager has explained, there are many, many ways to deal with that. I wanted to suggest tonight, since we have this huge audience here, that in the absence of our consultant on the costing, or the funding, that perhaps you could engage in the questions from the audience to keep them busy on the substance of what's this project do, and hold their questions on the funding until later, but at least get through that first part. Because I see everybody beginning to fidget here, and we have too big an audience to let them go.
Yeah, and I think,
Andrea?
So that one's
I'm sorry. Is that doable, Mike?
No, I think that works. That works. Mayor Festa?
Thank you. John Festa, 695 Harbor Lane. I have a whole list of questions. We'll hold the ones for the special assessment funding. I noticed in the presentation a number that stuck out on the hardening, on the credit, 4.4 million from FP&L. But in the report, it's 3.3. So that caught my eye. Not knowing what the number is isn't as important now as the following question for FP&L. What is your cost to harden the village?
Pardon me?
What is your cost going to be to harden the village as your current plan is in place?
I mean, the designs probably haven't been done yet, so I don't know what that cost would be. But from an underground perspective, we're typically $1 million a mile.
Okay, well, I'd like to know the difference in cost between what you think it's going to cost FP&L to do just your hardening versus I would use the 3.3 million figure, which is in the report, and not the 4.4 million that's up there now. How does that number relate? Is it about the same? Is it significantly more, significantly less than what FP&L is going to wind up spending out of pocket to put up new poles? It's an important question.
The question is, what credit do we provide? Should the village move forward with this project? It's spelled out in the Section 12 of the tariff, where one of the components of that equation to come up with the 16 million or whatever, that what we call the equivalent overhead system, that'll be presented in that final cost of the CIAC.
Right, but it's conceivable that it may cost FP&L less to do the hardening than to get the underground wiring. In other words, your contribution to the village conceivably could be less than what it will cost you out of pocket to do the hardening?
Well, if you do the underground, you're really getting two credits. You're getting the 4.4, the 3 point whatever you're talking about.
Right.
Okay, and then you're getting an additional credit, which is the overhead equivalent, which is part of the equation of the tariff.
Okay, that's not in the table, that credit. The only credit in the table.
It's part of the overall cost. The number that you saw, which was at 16.6. If we get to the 16.6, that credit that is in the equation is in that number that we provided.
Okay. What are the?
So it is a bit complicated, but just so that we can understand what this tariff looks like, I'm going to just really quickly read some of the elements of the formula. So it's the contribution in aid of construction. So the acronym is CIAC. And some of the things that are considered is the estimated cost to install the required underground facilities, the estimated cost to remove the existing overhead facilities, the net book value of the existing overhead facilities, the estimated cost that would be incurred to install new overhead facilities in lieu of underground to replace the existing overhead facilities, which is the hypothetical overhead facilities. It's also a function of the estimated salvage value of the existing overhead facilities to be roofed. Bear with me, I want us to understand the complexity of this. The 30-year net present value of the estimated non-storm underground versus overhead operational costs differential. And then the 30-year net present value of the estimated salvage avoided storm restoration costs, which has another acronym, calculated as below. And then there are some examples, and it's sort of a 4-page document that we'll put up onto the website. So to the point, you're right. There's, I think, room in here, and I look forward to having the discussion in more depth. And I will ask one follow-up question, if I may. Can you walk us through the binding cost estimate process and what we will learn after we go through that?
Yeah, the binding cost estimate, which we consider as the BCE, that's the actual cost. That's that 16.6 number that you saw up there in the beginning. And how we get there, is first you've done what we consider the ballpark estimate, which was an order of magnitude estimate. Should we convert the area of the entire village? And then in that letter, there's what we call the non-refundable deposit. That needs to be paid. And then I guess the toughest thing is we need to have a set of drawings that accurately show where existing underground facilities are in the ground, plus everybody's property line, right-of-way lines, and whatever, so that we can build an accurate design and come up with a number. What happens next is once they pay the non-refundable deposit, provide the plans, we come back with a preliminary layout of electrically, this is where the above ground boxes need to be placed. And that's the small transformers, the 4.5 by 4 foot pad. And then there are going to be some switch cabinets, the bigger boxes like you saw in that front picture there. And we lay that out and we provide that to the village. And then we ask the village to get with the residents to say, okay, here's where, whether it's going to be in the right of way or we're going to require an easement to move forward. Once the village has a good confidence level that, the easements can be acquired and everybody's on board, then they would come to us and say, okay, John, here's the adjustments that we would like to make. And so then what we would do is we would go back and finalize the estimate. And if, let's just say this is all done in one phase, which it's probably going to be highly unlikely, we would come back to what we consider the binding cost estimate, which is close to that 16.6 number that you saw up there, less the GAF. And then the village actually has 180 days on whether to accept that or forfeit the deposit. If the village was to move forward in that 180 days, we require two things. You need to sign the agreement, and then you need to pay the cost of the project up front. And that non-refundable deposit would be applied should you move forward in that 180 days.
Yeah, a couple other questions. What are the safety concerns for underground wiring?
The safety concerns, I think you saw the, undergrounding is not a silver bullet. Mm-hmm. Okay, if during a wind event, it's better to be underground. And during a storm surge, it's better to have everything overhead.
So as I understand it, in reading various reports, one of the big concerns in doing this project is safety, mostly as a result of tropical storms, in my opinion, because people are on the island during tropical storms. During hurricanes, certainly there's a safety problem, but we evacuate. We're not allowed to come back to the island until it's safe. So that's why I'm asking, so if we do get a flooding event that's caused by a tropical storm, we're all here. Less likely, in my opinion, as a scientist, that during a tropical storm we're going to get downage of poles, maybe wires occasionally. There could be significant flooding, not as much as a hurricane. Is that a concern for underground system during tropical storms?
As I said before, this is not a silver bullet, okay? We've been very fortunate through the storm seasons that we've only had a couple of surge events along the East Coast. However, until those waters recede, we can't go in there, okay? So I forget what hurricane it was, but it was in the Melbourne area that the waters needed to recede before we would get back in there and restore the service. And that's for overhead or underground.
Okay. the engineer report was excellent. I mean, I read through it a lot, and in there, it talks about the current outage is 94 minutes per year, and that with underground, it's going to be on the order of 19 minutes. Do you agree with that? And is that number, I assume that number does not take into account tropical storms or hurricanes?
Well, I don't know where you got those numbers.
From the engineer's report.
But, okay. I don't know who the engineer that wrote the report, but from FP&L's perspective, we have three different types of feeders. We have an overhead feeder, an underground feeder, and what we consider a hybrid feeder. It's a modification of both underground and overhead. And our data through the years indicates that the more that the circuit is underground, the more reliable the circuit is going to be in the future.
Okay, and it was pointed out that it would be 80% reliable, so that has to be relative to those numbers of 94 and 19. What are the general benefits to a community, the general benefits to go underground?
Again, this is an elective program. We're still an overhead company. So if the village wants to move forward, I think like they showed in the presentation on, I would probably say 90% of the jobs that I do, it's for aesthetics. And the benefit is the improved reliability that happens after that.
No, yeah, but my question is very focused because I understand the special assessment report is focusing on 3 benefits to the community as special benefits for property owners. And they're supposed to report to the village also what the general benefits are. And I'll ask that question then. But in your experience for FP&L, what are general benefits to community-wide when you go underground? Do you consider aesthetics a general benefit?
Well, from our perspective, again, this program was developed after the 2004-2005 storm season. And we heard 2 things from cities. We heard, number one, FP&L, you're too rigid with respect to easements that you're required, for all the underground. And the other item was cost, okay? We addressed the first one with respect to easements that we came up with a right-of-way agreement with basically says that, okay, village, if you would like us to underground, we're willing to put our facilities within that right-of-way. However, if it ever needs to be relocated in the future, it's at the village's expense. And if the village can't find a spot, then they're out there to acquire us an easement for our underground equipment. The second item was the GAF, which is the government adjustment waiver factor, which was the 4.4, or you would consider the 3.3 or whatever it was. That was based on cost, and how that cost was derived was part of it was during storms, instead of sending an army of folks down here to the village to restore all the overhead services, we work 24 hours a day. I can send what we call a restoration specialist, an RS, to come down here and troubleshoot the underground, and he can pick up most of the town or the village by himself.
Okay. Jess, can you weigh in on this a little bit? Or is this not the time for you?
In terms of?
Well, the general benefits.
To a community. I'm not interested in the general benefit to FP&L. What's the general benefit to this whole community by going underground?
I mean, I think the manager actually pointed out in her presentation. There's quite a few besides the aesthetics. That's not working.
Safety, reliability, and aesthetics are not being presented as general benefits. I want to make that clear. They're being presented as special benefits. So I'd like to learn what's the general benefit. Can any one of them or all of them be also considered general benefits? Yes.
Tom, if you could pass the mic to Tom.
Who said yes?
I believe the answer to your question is yes. It's safety, reliability, and aesthetics, and those are also general benefits to the citizenry, the people that live here and work here. It's a benefit to them as well, to have a safer environment, a more attractive environment, and a more reliable electric grid to serve their homes and businesses.
That's a good answer. I like to hear that answer because, again, the special assessment has to show specific benefit to the parcel.
Correct.
Not including the general. But the company that is hired to present to the village is obligated to also list the general benefits. I didn't see any general benefits listed. And if the general benefits are exactly the same as the special benefit, then it's going to be an interesting discussion on council as to who pays for what benefit.
Right, and I like the question, and I think that hopefully the next presentation they can walk you through some of those.
Andrea, can I also add to that?
Sure,
briefly?
please.
I think when you look at it as a whole, as a village, you have to look at when power goes down in places like your food mart or your gas station. Those are all services that are provided to the entire village, and so when those are out of service, everyone is kind of out of luck. So I think one of the general benefits could be that those services could remain operational for the entire village.
Including the pumps to drain the flooding streets, actually.
Madam Manager, I just want to say one more thing real quick, and that is that I think, and you'll let us know, and the council and the mayor, how you want us to address this. But obviously, from a public information perspective, we always want every question answered. We have obviously a short amount of time, but there's a couple of things that I think that you referred to about some of these statistics. One of what I'm doing, my staff is here as well, we're jotting down questions that either don't get answered or there's not enough time so that we can post that onto the website and then we can get back to you because we feel like every question needs to be answered. But for the benefit, I don't know if you want to address real quick, there was a question about some of the statistics that we have up there. I don't know if you just want to quickly say where you got those from so that you can answer that.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, the FPL issued a report in 2018, a reliability and storm hardening update. And those numbers were actually pulled from that report. So those are FPL issued numbers. And we gleaned the numbers that you see there from the data that they had presented in their report.
Those are Key Biscayne numbers.
No, those are overall Florida, yeah.
Excluding tropical storms and hurricanes.
We have a couple up there regarding Irma, but.
No, Luis, excuse me, no. Mayor Lindsay's here. She's going to ask a question. We've got one behind you, then you. We're just trying to keep track.
Yeah, I know, but that's what I mean. Let's keep moving because there's a lot of people here.
Good evening.
Real quick question. When you mentioned the storm surge reliability. Oh.
You're next. I'm sorry. You're queued up. You're queued.
Good evening. We're all trying, obviously, to do a cost-benefit analysis of this project. And something I'd like to know, which I think can be answered by both Kimley Horn and our FPL rep, Ms. John. Nice to see you. I believe that Pinecrest, the village of Pinecrest and Coral Gables did the overhead hardening projects. And I'd like to know how well they fared during the last hurricane so that we get an idea of, and how was it received? So we get an idea of communities that have already been through this, one of the alternatives, how has that gone?
I don't believe it.
I think what they're both saying back here is that they don't have that data right now. So I'm just writing down that we need to get whatever data is available. I don't know if you want to address further than that, but I don't think the specific data, right, we have of those two, correct?
Did they lose power?
Mayor, I don't, I want to say it was a year ago that I provided the village of Pinecrest their underground ballpark estimate. And at that time, I think they moved forward with the position that they came back to us and said they would like us to harden the overhead rather than go underground. So I think the statistics for the last storm, I don't believe we had hardened. I think that's happening right now as we speak.
And what about Coral Gables?
I would say Coral Gables is the same way.
Can you please check on that?
Yeah.
Sir, when you mentioned storm surge as a possible problem with the underground, is that in relationship to the transformers or some other thing?
If we have a storm surge, depending on the depth, I would say within the last 2 years, there's a lot of municipalities similar to the village that are putting in stormwater pumps for those situations. And we've actually tried to address that concern. And we usually have a standard pad that you would see around, the normal subdivisions, which is a 6-inch pad. And now we have a 24-inch pad to try to give it a little bit more, depth in reference to if there was a storm surge.
So it's transformers basically the problem, storm surge?
The whole depending on the depth of water that you're talking about, the pad mount transformers that are actually laying there, sitting on the ground, that's the concern that we do have.
And they don't make a waterproof cabinet, I assume?
Pardon me?
There's not a waterproof cabinet available?
I don't want to say there's not, but I probably say if we're looking at a $16 million number, you can probably knock that up 5 times if they were ever to do it. So.
Okay. So question, is there an elevation, minimum elevation, that you require the pads to be mounted at? In relationship to base flood elevation?
We don't have an elevation. Basically, if somebody, again, it's an elective program, we come out and we place the pad on the ground that exists there today.
Thank you.
I can add one thing to that, Councilman. As part of the planning and zoning work that we're doing, we do have a matrix of identified land development code revisions, and one section of that matrix looks at these resilient strategies. So we can definitely figure out how the BFE will tie into FPL's guidelines.
The current outages we have when they're sunny and clear skies, how will that be improved by undergrounding? Are the issues the transformers that need to be replaced and updated? Is it the substation that has a problem? Because we have power failures, intermittent power failures going on with clear skies and no storm.
Again, I'm here to. I actually handle the whole state. I do the underground from Jacksonville all the way around back to the Skyway Bridge. But in reference to the blue sky conditions, let me just address this question. I have a couple projects right now in Miami Beach, and they brought up the same concerns that you have with respect to that. And I saw her put up there. Tree trimming, okay? We consider it line clearing. We don't trim trees, we line clear, okay? So in most cases, again, it's most cases, those blue sky outages that you see would be outages from vegetation, okay? Not 100%, but I would probably say 80 to 90% of the time, it's vegetation. And again, and Tom Bradford can back me up on this, I'm doing Palm Beach as we speak, and when you go in their backyards, just like you all have, in most cases, you've got those laterals that feed in the back. I know everything looks very nice, but we consider that a jungle. And there's a lot of cases that you can't see our lines up in that vegetation. So
it's shorting from the trees.
Yes, sir. In most cases, that's what happens.
Yeah, just my question's not as much about the benefits underground versus hardening as the funding mechanism that we're contemplating here. I had the privilege to be the mayor of Key Biscayne and serve on council for 4 additional years after that. And from 2002 to 2010, put roughly 90 to 100 million dollars in infrastructure into the village. And it was never about who already had it or who doesn't have it or who's going to get more of it. It was a village. And my only concern here is we've got other projects moving forward. Beach restoration is going to be a constant thing. And are the condominiums going to pay for 90% of the beach restoration because they're benefiting from it more? Or is this a one-time deal here? I mean, we spent $2 million on the Mashed Island Bridge. I could assure you half the people in here don't go over the Mashed Island Bridge once a month, if that. We spent $9+ million on the community center. I don't think everybody in here is a member of the community center, and we still subsidize it today. Even if you're not a member, you are subsidizing the community center in your taxes because there's a shortage between the membership and what it costs to run. So my only concern and this is to the council, this isn't to anybody else here, I think every council since incorporation has looked at burying the lines. And it's always been a funding issue. How much is it going to cost? Where are we going to get the money? I just, from a personal standpoint, don't like going down the road of assessing individuals based on whether they have it already or not. And that's just a personal preference because I think every project you're going to deal with moving forward, you're going to have to look at that objectively the same way as this, if this is the way it's done, because every penny that every council has spent since incorporation, there's 5 mayors here, 6. Yeah, I don't think we've ever assessed for anything. So I just hope the council that's here now keeps that in mind when this project goes moving forward, because I think the job that you guys have done is fabulous, and I think this is something that is overdue, personally, and I hope it gets done, but I hope it gets done the way it's been done, and we don't try to reinvent the wheel. So thank you all. I got to go to Rendazzo's. Support the community.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I need to get going also. I got some work that I need to do for a living. But I agree with Buzz. I hadn't done my homework before this past week. And I talked to as many people as I possibly could, including administration, and came to the same conclusion that we had never done this before. If we open that Pandora's box, I don't know how we close it. Every time that we have another capital project going forward, we're going to have to decide, well, who is it benefiting or who is it not benefiting? I think that's a huge mistake. I at one point I thought differently, and I admit it. And I've told those people that I had discussed that with before that I have come to a different conclusion. More important than anything else, I want to tell you that I've been working a lot on infrastructure, as many of you know, and we must do this project. We can't let the funding mechanism bog us down and not let us do it. If we bring this to a vote for a special assessment, we have 5,400 folio numbers that believe, many of them believe, they don't need to spend the money that other of us, like 1,600 other folio numbers, do believe that we need to spend the money. It shouldn't be this. We shouldn't be talking about it this way. We shouldn't be discussing about whether the east side or the west side. But if you take a vote and 5,400 people are going to vote that don't necessarily need this particular project to happen in order to have better service or whatever, because they're already underground, and 1,600 on the other side do believe that they need to have it done, I really fear that we're not going to get this project done. We need a reliable power source in order to start our resiliency plan, in order to be able to start putting our pumps, which we have, had in a master plan for a long time. We need to get this going. Please don't let this get bogged down in a funding source, please. And one thing you can do is you can agree, let's do the project, borrow the money, pay it from the general fund until you decide which way you want to go. But please don't stop the project. Please get it done.
Amen.
Okay, so the consultant is here. I think, Mayor, we have maybe 2 more comments, and then we can. Yeah, I think we got.
My comment is that about assessments, and I personally want the project done and do not care which funding option is selected. The council never should have allocated the money for the assessment study in the first place. But the study was allocated, money was paid, and I think everyone has an obligation to at least listen as to how that result looks. It can be denied immediately, but the decision was made not by the task force. The decision was made by previous council to do the study. Spent a lot of money on the study. Now listen to the results.
Anybody else wants to speak before we go back to the consultants? Okay, Alan's right there. Oh, just move around the room. All right?
Are we waiting for the consultant? Is that why we're taking comments?
Well, the consultant's here, so that's what I was saying.
Oh, let's hear from the consultant.
Why don't we go ahead with the presentation and then have comments for later? No one's even heard the presentation.
Okay, I do want to speak on the funding mechanism, which I think is outrageous, to give them a feel for what's coming. But I'm happy to listen to them first. But you know what? I'm here. I'm going to talk with all due respect, and I appreciate it. Having served on a committee at the request of the council, I certainly appreciate all the hard work that goes into it. And I would say, with regard to the portion of the work that was done that goes to whether or not it's a good idea to do this project, the work was excellent. My understanding coming in is that through the happenstance of who the consultant happened to be, that part of this recommendation was a recommendation on the public, on the funding source, which for 3 reasons I think is ridiculous and awful. The first, with all due respect, the first being that, as my good friend Pat Woodson put it in her editorial in the Islander this week, this is more, comparing this situation and calling for a special taxing district on Key Biscayne. We're not like Manhattan. We're not like New York City with 5 boroughs with millions of people. We are much more analogous, as Pat put it, to a small boat in the ocean that has many leaks, okay? And for somebody on the port side to say, well, that leak's on the starboard side, they should take care of it, is absolute nonsense. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is to view all of these, this particular issue of underground utilities outside of the holistic problems we have. Beach restoration, water pumping, utilities, land acquisition in order to take care of outflow is nonsense. It all needs to be handled holistically. And as I've been telling council after council after council for years now is the time to get a general obligation bond for all of our necessities now while interest rates remain low, okay? If you wait a year or two while you're deciding what it is you're going to do, the rates will go up and the project will cost twice as much. Borrow the money now. Have the courage to go to the taxpayers, and this would be all the taxpayers. We're not talking about people who own land through an S corp, okay, who would be voting on the special assessment. This would be the people who elected you, okay? Go to them and say, you know what? It's time for us to harden our land now, just like our neighbors to the north on Miami Beach have done. Borrow the money you need now. They borrowed $500 million. We're going to need to borrow a whole lot less than that, but it's going to be a lot of money. Do it now. Don't wait. Put this divisive plan aside and let's get it done now. It's time now. It's time for courage now. Do it.
I just have a quick question. It's not about the money. It has to do with actual infrastructures for the gentleman for Florida, Power and Light. It's obvious from the presentation and everything that's already been put out that it's not a totally underground system. There's going to be parts of it that are above ground. That's normally the transformers. I believe he said it was going to be on a 4.5 by 4 foot pads. And I'm going to tell you right now, one of your biggest problems, having lived in one of these communities that got converted out in California, you're going to have, not in my front yard, is what people are going to say. Don't put that 4.5 foot by 4 foot pad in my front yard, and it's going to be a real problem with you. But one thing, when you talked about that size, I know that the parts of the island that are underground, some of them are in vaults and they're old technology. 4.5 by 4 foot, what technology are you going to be using? Is it the latest and the greatest, and can we get that footprint down smaller?
The standard footprint for our single phase transformer is the 4.5 by 4 foot pad. So,
is that the latest and greatest technology? Or
the transformers that we buy today are stainless steel, so that's the latest and greatest that you have on the books. There is a switch.
But normally switch box aren't going to be on residential streets, I don't think, are they?
Well, a lot of the community to the west? Yeah. A lot of the community to the west, there will be some above ground switch cabinets. And they're an 8 by 8, a much larger chamber that they have. And then we have a what we call a Vista switch, which has a smaller footprint, which a lot of the coastal communities are going with. And it's a little bit more expensive. However, the benefit is it's a hermetically sealed switch, which means if it gets wet, it'll still be able to operate.
Yeah, and Alan raised, I think, some very good points. That in order to get this project done, it's very important that we have buy-in from the entire community. And the way to get buy-in is for people to perceive that all of these projects are being viewed in a holistic manner. We have the issue of flooding. We have the issue of our stormwater system. And in the past, a line was drawn at the gate of the condominiums, which was not the way to do it. And if we're going to provide, if we have residents who are taxed and they're not provided services, then you don't get buy-in. So it's very important. I support this project. I think it's very important that we move forward with this. But in order to get the buy-in from everybody, We need to address those issues like Alan is raising, stormwater drainage. That should be a village-wide project, and it should include all the condominiums and all the private roads in the village. So that's something that we need to think about, and how we put that together.
Gary?
I totally agree with everything that's been said as to why the assessment idea is a terrible idea for this community, but I want to add one perspective to it that hasn't been mentioned. I live on Island Drive. We have undergrounding. I have lost power almost every single time we've had a storm, a hurricane, a wind event, or anything else, and it's not because my lines blew down. My lines are under the ground. I have outages because someone 2 blocks from me had a transformer blowout, and it affected, however the power grid runs, my power just like it affected theirs. So the whole concept of anyone that has undergrounding shouldn't have to pay an equal amount because they already have it is total nonsense. Unless we all get together and strengthen our entire power grid, then it doesn't matter whether some of us have undergrounding or not. It doesn't do us any good. So just like everything else we've always done, this is to benefit everyone in this community. It's one community. It's all for one for all, just like we've always been. And it's just not fair to say somebody dug a hole in front of my house and buried the lines, so I'm okay, because we're not okay. Everything that goes wrong with our system affects everybody.
Thank you. Regarding the answers that you're putting on your website, we're going to have water events here. So I'm wondering if there's any statistics. What happens after there's 3-4 feet of water that come through the island, across the island? And if you have statistics, maybe for the future to say, okay, this is typically when a water event happens, you have downtime about a day or two, and the repairs are so on. And if we could have that data, that would be, I think, important also. Thank you.
One more question?
I came in late, so I'm sorry, but I may have missed this. But is there a deadline on our decision relating to this? And if there's a deadline, is it this year or next year, or there is no deadline?
Well, what I would say, Tom, my name's Tom Bradford. If hardening is an issue for you, then you want to be able to have made a decision relative to undergrounding before the hardening begins. I think I read in the master plan that the current FPL plan for hardening in Key Biscayne is starting in 2022. I could be wrong, but you need a decision long before that to be fair to FPL and to be fair to the administration that's going to have to go underground if that's in fact what you end up doing.
I have a response to that.
Don, and then Luis?
Yeah. Question is there a deadline on this? This task force has been operating for the last 4 months or 3 months on an imposed deadline that we were advised by the village manager that we needed to move forward in order for the village, if there was going to be some kind of a referendum, and I'm not clear as to what it was, some kind of a vote on something, it has to be in place before the October or something. Otherwise, we're delayed a year or two in the process. And I wish some of the lawyers or people who are sitting here would comment on what that's all about, or perhaps, Andrea, you might tell us what you told us.
Yes. So two deadlines that we're looking at. At one point, the village clerk got confirmation from the county elections department that they're doing upgrades to their system. And so that from, I think it was April to October of this year, they wouldn't be able to process the ballot question for us. So that put a little bit of pressure on that timeline. As we know, the special assessment and the GOB processes are administered differently. The elections department would not do the special assessment mail-in ballot. So if that route is selected, we would need to go through the clerk's office and through, there are 2 or 3 private providers that administer these processes for us. So that was the deadline on the elections department. The deadline with regard to hardening, I think is, what we have here is a 22 start time, 2024 end time. I think in reality, FPL has been wanting to harden for some time, and as the village has shown due diligence and efforts towards that, they've allowed us to go through our process. So does that answer your question?
Again, the 2022 deadline, again, we can't snap our fingers and by 2024 the polls are going to be up. So that's what the 2-year buffer, would be.
Excuse me, John, could you just sort of set a scenario for us? Let's assume that we get a major flood event and we are undergrounded and we do the upgraded hermetically sealed boxes. Okay. I think you said that, and let's assume there's also a large wind event, say Cat 3, and some of the wires come down, assuming we harden or non-harden. You made a statement, I thought earlier, that you said you could send a single-sourced individual to come out versus a team of FPL providers to troubleshoot that. Could you walk us through that a little bit? Because I thought that was quite important.
Yeah,
And maybe a timeline as well.
Again, when we go into storm mode, which is, really an hour after the storm, but everybody, doesn't really see us for like 10 hours or whatever. If we have an underground area, and again, when we restore by the masses. We try and get the most people up the quickest, okay, because that keeps everybody happy. If you're an underground area, okay, and let's just say we work 16 hours a day. We have shift work. We work 24 hours a day. If I have an underground area and I can get 5,000 people up and I can send one guy to 3 or 4 switch cabinets that's totally underground and he can troubleshoot those feeders, he's got the ability to pull 5,000 people up just by him within a couple hours, okay? Like in Tom's case, he had an island of 9,500 people, and it's overhead, and it's even worse, it's rear up. 9,500 people is not really a big number when your 4 million people are out. So we're going for the masses, but then once we do have the resources to address the 9,500 people, we'll send an army of guys over there, whether it's 30, whether it's 100, whether it's 200, to get over there and get in everybody's backyards, climb the poles, and put the wire back up on the poles. Okay? So that is a daylight event. So we work from 5 till 10 at night. But the 24 hours is the stuff that we can do. If it's underground, we can send a guy out there to try and troubleshoot to bring people up. So that's the advantage of being, at least from an underground perspective. But again, it's, a wind event, it's better to be underground. A storm event, it's better to be overhead.
Luis? Yes, thank you, Mayor. I'm so happy to see so many of you former council members, mayors and otherwise, because I think most of us were here at creation, difficult 27 years ago. After that, I was in the Public Service Commission, and I fought for undergrounding in the rate base. That is another way of saying for everybody in Florida to pay it. I lost that battle. I got a lot of bad press throughout the state. The establishment won, and this is this peculiar system that we have. But the philosophy, the dream of creating this village, which is beyond any one decision, is that we want one community. And that is why, as you know, and some of you here were there in those spaces, we did not go with districts for council because that would have been a disaster. But that little thing keeps popping its head every once in a while in our community. And that is why I said at the beginning, I hope you were here, that at the two other meetings that I was a guest of the Utility Commission, has done an extraordinary job. I'm amazed at the quality of the work they've done. I said, you know, the system is that an elected council, a new council, will have to make this decision. So you're leaning a little bit towards advocacy, not them, but the report. I read it. You heard me earlier today. The pictures are a little misleading. So I said, don't confuse me with the facts. I already made up my mind kind of thing. And so I get criticized because I'm too outspoken, but I feel supported now with some of you who've been there because I always say that I'm here to build on the work you've done before. There are 6 or 7 of you here. And I'm sure you spent a lot more time on this. So I buy into the philosophy and I say I have an open mind because if I see a compelling argument to go the other way, then I would buy it. But I think the process, because the voters are the ones who really were entrusted with their money, need to be informed. And we're getting lost in the forest, and we're not seeing the trees. I mean, and this is not a discussion, as I guess it's going to start now, about assessment. I'm still open about and leaning in the direction of the other one. But the process has to kind of get back to balance so the people who are watching us know that we're doing, the 7 councilmen and this board is doing the best they can for get the biggest bang for the buck. But I mean, I'm glad that you guys brought it up because it sort of stops this drifting in the direction of advocacy, and maybe we can rationally look at it calmly together. So I just want to thank you all elected officials who spoke today and some who didn't, like Frank, but I know his mind. Thank you.
Okay. I had a question on the previous presentation about the different funding mechanisms and specifically the debt payments. You indicated that like each one would certainly trigger a millage increase. And my question is, do those numbers take into account the debt that's going to be falling off? Like we have close to $3 million in debt falling off by 2022.
Right. So in what I presented, we do have Lourdes is here who can speak to the total debt cap. In my presentation, all that I did was take the millage that corresponded to the debt issuance.
So it doesn't consider the fact that we are losing $3 million of debt service.
The debt cap analysis does, but that wasn't considered in my presentation.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
Thank you. And what we're so we'll
that's what I needed.
Okay.
Than's.
So, Mayor.
Fernando's got a question, and Brett, and let's start getting. We got to get through the presentations.
I'll be brief on this. I just want to follow up with what Michael was saying. That was a good interchange that you had with John as it related to the maintenance component on it. And what I was inferring out of that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is does that mean that FP&L would be, when you look at your bill, would that be a reduction in the maintenance? Because you technically, when you have to fix these lines and you have to get down there, you don't necessarily need a crew. Would you account for that? Is it fair to say that undergrounding constitutes a lesser maintenance cost, and as a result, can we derive that it would be a lesser impact to the bills of the residents?
It's really the opposite.
Really?
Yeah.
How would that be?
Costs more to maintain than does overhead. Again, as the manager alluded to in some of the the benefits of the system, when everything's overhead, we can drive by with a truck and you can see where the wire has been snapped or fell down. When it's underground, we have to send out there and troubleshoot. The system that we would install here for the village is standard in our system is what we consider a loop system. So we can backfeed from 2 different areas. And what we would do is we would have to isolate that fault or that damaged area or damaged component, get everybody back up. And that in itself takes time. And then instead of putting the wire back up, say with a splice or whatever, we typically would have to pull the wire out and push it back in. So underground operationally costs us more to maintain than does the overhead.
Okay,
And
that's not what I had read, but I take your word.
It was actually filed with the Public Service Commission. It's part of the equation that the manager will put up on the website.
It'd be interesting to see what those numbers are as it relates to, above ground maintenance. Yes.
Can I just get? Oh, sorry.
Well, I think that you may have answered it somewhat in this last question or the last answer you had, but the redundancy, the looped effect, and and how that affects reliability. So, my understanding is that when you're above ground, everything is linear. Something goes out along the line, everything goes out along that line. Where when we're underground, it's actually looped. So if something goes out, I'm not sure if it's automatic, but power can be fed in the other direction, and power can be restored very quickly.
Currently, we're in the process of putting what we call AFS, the automated feeder switching, sectionalizing. We're going to have that both on the overhead system. She really didn't have a picture of it up on there, but we do have the automated or the smart switches out on the overhead, and we do have them now on the overhead. On the underground. So we'll have both. However, just like overhead, when we see a wire down, a guy physically has to go up there in a bucket and put it back up. The same thing is going to happen. You can isolate to a point on the underground system, but you still have to have somebody to go over there and troubleshoot to address the problem, switch it out, and then get the crews to come back and fix the damage.
Okay, thank you.
Allison, do you have one last point?
I do, but I think everyone's getting kind of tired, and maybe after the meeting I could get some of this from some members of the task force. But my question was really, before we move on to the funding, I'd love to hear, having heard some conflicting things, this task force has seemed to have really said, we think undergrounding is the way to go. And then I'm hearing all kinds of little Swiss cheese that I would love to, if anyone wants to share why they're so passionate about the project. I mean, you could call me if people here aren't interested in hearing them.
Why don't we have that answered later, because there's 7 different opinions.
All right.
9, technically. Let's move on.
Okay, so couple housekeeping issues. We do have some comment cards, so if as we go through this you feel inspired to ask a question but not necessarily publicly, please feel free to jot those questions down. I also did want to make one point of clarification with regard to Raftelis's contract. So Raftelis was contracted specifically to study the fee assessment methodology. Their task was not to evaluate all funding mechanisms. I can tell you over the last few weeks as we've gone through this, the staff, my staff and me, we have been looking at other considerations based on the feedback that we've been getting from the council and the community. So I assure you, Habib we wouldn't hurt his feelings if we take his assessment or not, but this is an opportunity to understand the methodology and hopefully to learn. I'll tell you, I learned a lot going through this exercise. So, Key Biscayne nice, he'll present his work, and if there are questions, he can, but he's not getting a commission. He could care less which way we go. So please feel free to ask questions and look at what and the work that the team has done. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Andrea. Good evening, Habib Isaac with Raftelis. I got a little bit of thunder taken away from me, but that's what I was going to start with is we're a third-party consultant. I've done this type of work for 16 years. And in terms of utility undergroundings, I've done a few in Florida. To name a few is town Palm Beach, Jupiter Inlet Colony, and town of Gulfstream. And then also look at the town of Jupiter, but they decided to hold off on that one. And then I live in California, and there's been quite a few undergroundings with assessments in California. The assessment procedures and the provisions of law are very, very similar. They're both based on benefit. And if I opened up to more than just undergrounding, just overall assessments, fire assessments, landscaping assessments, Assessments are used quite often by municipalities. And actually up and down Florida, assessments are used quite a bit for fire protection districts, and where they fund almost all the ongoing operations on it. My background is applied mathematics, and one other thing I wanted to mention is whether you incur debt or whether you decide to go with the millage rate or go with an assessment, that's definitely the purview of the constituency and the village council. My role is to be a third party, non-prejudiced, unbiased in terms of how to come up with this approach. The one thing that we always do, we always make sure, because of utility undergroundings, it's so unique to the area that we're working in. It's not something where you could just take the parcel data, put it into a model, have it, chug away, and then spit out the results. It's something where you have to really take into account what are the overhead lines looking like, where are they located, are there areas that are undergrounded. So with that, the assessments provide a basis of, is it a fair and equitable manner to do with an assessment? Some folks might decide, yes, it is, based on what I'm going to show you. Others might feel that the millage rate is more equitable. But there will also be people that feel the millage rate is not, because it's just based on value, irrespective of where you're located or what improvements you have. I need to point to this window, I take it?
You too.
There we go. So this quick agenda I'm going to go through. There's going to be some, quite a bit of, some slides are going to be kind of dense, but I'm not going to go through every single component. There's also going to be uploaded that you have the ability to look at it afterwards if you wish, but I'm going to hit the key points, and if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to ask me. Let me go a little closer. There we go. All right, so non-avalon assessments. So, actually, I'm going to do one thing. Am I projecting my voice enough? Can you hear me? I'm going to get rid of the mic.
I think that we're recording it, so for the TV, it's better.
Okay, will do. So it's an alternative funding mechanism separate from ad valorem. Assessments are based on special benefit. It accounts for unique characteristics of the municipality and the properties. And each property's charge is proportional share of cost based on that benefit. So what I need to do is come up with a logical approach that allocates the cost to the properties based on the level of benefit conferred on those properties. I already mentioned that assessments are used in Florida. Here are a couple of the agencies that used it for utility undergroundings. And then why an assessment for utility undergrounding? More equitable by taking into account the status of undergrounding for each parcel and type of property. Some parcels already have certain facilities undergrounded. So the question is, should that be accounted for? Some people say, no, let's just look at it as a community as a whole. And then here's another big one. It doesn't matter if you're a government property or not. No one is exempt from the assessment. So if you benefit, which means government benefit, parks benefit, schools benefit, every parcel that benefits is going to be assessed. And the reason we do that is because if we didn't do that, then one could say, I'm being charged more than my special benefit because who's paying for the city hall? I don't benefit from that city hall, the improvements going on around them. So that's why every single property has to be assessed. No one is exempt. So in Florida, the law does not specify what methodology to use or what formula should be used for calculating the assessments. The assessment methodology apportions cost to each parcel based on benefit. There has to be a logical relationship between improvements and benefit of property. That's actually case law in Florida. That's pretty broad. It just has to be logical and make sense. And equivalency, so what we do is we come up with an equivalency to derive the special benefit analysis between properties. What we do is we identify equivalent benefit units to each property based on what is one benefit unit as a baseline. We define that. So in our definition for each of the categories of benefit that I'll go through, we try to correlate it to our baseline as your typical single family home. We look at the characteristics of that home, and then we apply different benefit units to other parcels based on the baseline of your typical single-family home. So for example, just real quick, if there's a property or non-residential property that has a lot of acreage, there's a certain number of equivalent homes that could fit on that property. That'd be a way of that property getting more benefit units assigned to it than your typical single-family home. So what are some factors that we could look at? We may include the lot size, the building square footage, the type of property, and proximity to the improvements. All that's going to be incorporated into this analysis. So special benefit categories. With utility undergroundings, this is pretty much industry standard across the nation, that the improved benefits are improved safety, improved reliability, and improved aesthetics. Notice I'm saying improve because you already have these components as part of your utilities. The reason why it's special benefit is because you already receive utility service, and by undergrounding everything, that's the special benefit, the actual improvements to have everything go from overhead to underground. So it improves the safety, it reduces the potential of hazardous conditions in the event of severe storms or natural disasters throughout the village and for each specific property. So you benefit from the village as a whole, and you benefit based on what's going on locally to your property. Improve reliability, reduce outages of the network, and new upgraded lines throughout the village and properties. And then improve aesthetics, remove and eliminate heavy visual concentration, electric lines, and communication facilities throughout the town. So I'll go first with safety and aesthetics. We have them together because we use the same approach. They're very similar in terms of how we assign benefit units. For safety benefits, you're undergrounding the entire village network, and then you have your property specific benefits for removal overhead facilities adjacent to your property. Those are the two main benefits. So the factors that we use is the size of property, and then we look at the number of sides fronting overhead facilities. One thing that we found one thing we did when we first started this project was we came to Key Biscayne and we walked the entire village. We were here for a week and we looked at going up and down the streets, looking at how the utilities are laid out. And we noticed that there are some properties that don't front any overhead utilities, and there's some properties that front utilities on all four of their sides, all sides of the property. So that's something that we took into account. One thing I want to point out that utilities that are across the street are also considered adjacent to your property because those poles can reach your property. The only exception to that is Crane and Boulevard. And that one, utilities along the Creighton are only related to that side of that street. So when we assign benefit units, we look at the average single-family home with 4 sides fronting utilities. So that's going to be defined as one benefit unit. If you're a single-family home and you have all 4 sides of your property with utility lines or poles, that's one benefit unit. Then if you are a property that has 3 sides, then you're going to get a reduction in the amount of benefit units that are assigned to you. If you have no sides fronting any utilities, then you'll have a baseline of half of a benefit unit, 0.5. So this is a way to distinguish or differentiate from one parcel that has a lot of overhead utilities versus a property that already has undergrounded around their property. So here's an example. So the baseline is 0.5. Let's see if there's other. And then if you have one line, you might have seen this from the previous presentation, then you get tacked on 0.125 more benefit units. And then if you have another side, there's another 0.25. So as you have 4 sides, that 0.125 times 4 will sum up to 1 when you add 0.5. And you have one side, you have 0.625, 0.75 with 2, and 0.875 with 3. I want to show you some examples. As I mentioned, we walked through the whole village. So these are all the poles and the utility lines. And I just want to point out an example of here are 2 parcels. where these two parcels front 4 sides of their property adjacent to overhead facilities. So from that standpoint, they should get assigned more benefit units compared to this parcel right here, where there's only 3 sides. And then lastly, we have this whole block where all these parcels are only fronting 1 side. So this shows that there's definitely a big difference between property to property. And this is what you get to achieve with an assessment. You're able to account for these components. I don't mind if you go millage or not, but I'm comparing the difference because that's one thing that is common for me to do. With the millage, all it's going to worry about is when you bought this property, what was the market like? And then it's possible that if you bought this property a long time ago and someone over here bought it just recently, they're going to be paying substantially more than this property that's going to have more improvements or benefit more from the construction of work that's going to occur. That's just an observation. I'm not saying that means this is the best way to go. That's just me showing the difference between the two. And then here's another example. So this whole road, it's already undergrounded. It's indirect overhead because it does get served by the overhead facilities. So just that street alone is undergrounded. So from this standpoint, when I look at this, again, an outside person looking in, I would say these properties, based on the safety and aesthetics, should get assessed less than the other properties I just showed you. Now, one other thing we want to do is not every parcel is the same size. So we also have to take into account how big is that are each and every parcel. So when we look at the size of a parcel, the typical single family home is 0.24 acres in Key Biscayne. That's the average, is a quarter of an acre. So when you get assigned benefit units, you're going to get assigned benefit units based on how many quarter acres are you. So if you're 1 acre, you'll get assigned 4 benefit units. However, what we want to do is also make sure that as you get bigger and bigger your lot, that parcel, we also want to account for the fact that your return on benefit diminishes, where as you have a bigger area, you're most likely getting further and further removed from where the improvements are actually occurring because you're further away from the frontage. So when we have 1 acre, it's assessed at 100%. The second acre, we ratchet it down to 90% of that acre. So we have a sliding scale to come up with the assessable acreage of that parcel. So if everyone's 1 acre or less, you're being charged for that full acre. It's just looking at when parcels get up to a significant size, especially there's a few parcels that are more than 10 acres, then 10 acres or more are accounted for at 10%. So this provides equivalency between other land uses in relation to the single family home. And then one thing I want to point out with condominiums, there's a substantial number of condos in the village, and I'm sure many of you may live in condos. The one thing that we did here, which we also did in Palm Beach, is when we assign benefit units, we first assign the benefit units to the condominium complex as a whole, as if it's one parcel. And then because that pretty much makes it equivalent to a single family home, we assign benefit units based on the complex. And then once we do, then we apportion those benefit units to the individual condominiums that are associated with that complex based on the building square footage of those condos. So we're still acknowledging the fact that there's a difference between a 1-bedroom and a 3-bedroom condo in the complex, but you're only being assessed for the benefit of that complex. So for example, if that complex gets assigned 10 benefit units, then that's the only amount that's going to be apportioned to the condominium, individual condos within that complex. And then there are a few, let me go back one. there are a few single-family homes that are bigger than 1 acre. There's around 56 single-family homes. So here's another pictorial that you might have seen earlier of how the acreage gets assessed to come up with assessable acreage. So if you were just 5 acres, you would get assessed 3 acres on there. The next one. Now reliability. Reliability, you have to improve reliability through reduced outages and then new upgraded lines. The additional factors we considered was, what is the status of the underground where you're located? Are you being served, are you 100% overhead? So that's someone that actually gets their service through overhead facilities right now. We have indirect overhead, which was that neighborhood that I showed you before that had no lines going to that street, but it is being served indirectly. So that's indirect overhead. Through one of the reports we found with FPL, and we have someone representing them here with John, it showed that indirect overhead networks outperformed or had 35% less outages than networks that were 100% overhead. So we're using that information to incorporate into our analysis. And that report had 5 years of data. So there's a pretty substantial data set that was utilized. And then we also have in this area direct underground all the way to the substation. So that's a little bit different too. When you look at properties that are 100% underground, those type of networks outperform by 80%. So we're also taking that into account. They still benefit for the village as a whole being undergrounded, but their assignment of benefit units is going to be substantially less compared to someone that is 100% overhead. So we're using this information to come up with reliability factors. If you're 100% overhead, then you are 1. If you're indirect overhead, you get assigned 0.65 benefit reliability factor, which accounts for the 35% reduction in outages. And if you're direct underground, which is most of the east side, then you're gaining a multiplier of 0.2. So as an example, if you were 100% overhead a single family home compared to a single family home that was already undergrounded all the way to the substation, that single family home be assigned 0.2 benefit units instead of 1 benefit unit. Yes.
How did you come up with this?
Well, I'm showing you right now one was based on the outages. I'm using that information to do a reduction based on the frequency of outages and the time duration of outages. It outperforms by that percentage, so I'm giving that percent as a discount. Okay. And then here's I don't know if you can see the colors that well, but what this is showing is the Key Biscayne and how much of the territory is overhead, 100% overhead, how much of it is indirect, and how much of it is already direct undergrounded. This mint color, all these parcels here are already direct undergrounded to the substation. So I think when I see this, this is very important information and data to incorporate into the analysis. Again, what we're trying to do is show a logical relationship to the benefit received, and this data is being incorporated helps us show that differentiation. The ultimate goal of what I'm trying to do here is show that there is a differentiation in the benefit conferred on properties, and then correlate that to spread the project cost. And give you an example, similar to last time, but now with reliability. Here we have reference number 1023, so you can't see the number, but that one would get a discount. And then number 7, because it has direct overhead facilities, would get assigned 1. And then we have the reliability factor, but we still need to define what is 1 benefit unit. And because we're talking about reliability, and that reliability is to having utilities, we said building square footage makes the most sense in assigning benefit units. And again, we want to go off of your typical single family home. We did that with safety and aesthetics with the acreage. Now we're doing a billion square footage. On average, the billion square footage of a single family home is 4,000 square feet. Now I understand there's a broad range of properties in this village, but we're just looking at the baseline. What is one? So anything that's up to 4,000 square feet is one benefit unit, and then anything that's more than that, it gets assigned in 0.5 increments of benefit units. So if you're 6,000 square foot home, then you'll get assigned 1.5. If you're 5,000 square feet, you're still 1. If you're 8,000, then you're 2. So what we do here is if you're 4,000 square feet, you're 1, and then you are direct underground to the substation, then your benefit unit will be 0.2. If you're 6,000 square feet, then you'll be 1.5, and you're direct underground, that 1.5 will be multiplied by the reliability factor of 0.2.
2,000 square foot increments?
0.5
benefit for
Yeah, when it's over 4,000 square feet, then we assign it by 0.5 increments. Correct. So every 2,000 square feet more, we show a difference. Let me go back one. So your final benefit units to each parcel, you take the EBUs assigned based on square footage, and then you multiply it by your reliability factor. Also, I want to point out, everyone has taken their time to be here tonight. I'm also here, but I'll be here as long as you want me to afterwards, and I can even pull up your specific parcel, look it up, show you how we calculated your benefit units. So we have that information with us today. Now, I just want to show just how the condominiums are assigned. First, I'll go with safety. So we first calculate the accessible acreage based on the complex, the entire condominium complex as a whole. Then we take the condominium complex accessible acreage to determine how many typical single-family homes, if you will. The baseline is 0.24 to get the total number of benefit units to the complex. Then after that, we multiply it by the adjacent factor, whether, how many size do you have facilities adjacent to your property. So they have, most condos have none, so they will be 0.5. The adjacent factor would be 0.5 times the benefit units. Once we do that at the complex level, now we have the total benefit units to the complex. We then apportion it to the condos based on the building square footage of each condo. And then when we look at reliability, we do something similar. We take condo building square footage, each individual condo, okay? So then most condos are less than 4,000. So usually what this happens is becomes the total number of condos is the total sum. And then from there, we take total EBUs to the complex, we roll it all up, times it by the reliability factor, and then we apportion it back to the condominiums, again, based on building square footage. So we show differentiation between a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom. So let's look at results, because this gives you a broader picture of what's going on. After we apply all this information, this analysis, this approach, here is first, these are the properties by percentage that are direct underground, indirect overhead, and direct overhead. So this is the makeup of your village in terms of the current service provided. But now, based on the way we do our assessments, this is how much of the total assessment these categories are paying. So even though direct overhead wasn't a big percentage of the total parcels, they're taking on a big percentage of the total cost, because that's where the improvements are occurring. And then even though direct underground was the most parcels, they're taking on less of the cost because those improvements are not occurring directly in front of them. So this is what an assessment allows you to do. It allows you to customize it in a way that is logical and correlates to the improvements being proposed. Here's another summary. This is how much of the assessment is being paid for by the different types of properties. So condominiums as a whole will be funding 37% of the total cost. Single family would be funding 50% of the total cost. And this is primarily because a lot of the single family homes are in the direct overhead area. And then we get to what is the average annual assessment by property type. Single family homes is right around $1,250 on average. Multifamily, those are basically a complex. Condominiums are $216 on average, but it's going to vary based on what complex you reside within. Commercial condos are $502, and then these commercial and government, they're bigger because they're bigger parcels that make them up. And then I'm not going to go through this, but one thing that I have as part of the PowerPoint that is going to be uploaded is how do I calculate my benefit units if I'm single family, if I'm condo, if I'm non-residential, and then what do some of these terms mean? So we just have that as an appendix in our PowerPoint. For your leisure after tonight, you go and glass of wine and look at the analysis. But with that, I want to open it back up with, actually, I'm going to leave it on some of these slides right here. I'll leave it right there for now. But I did want to open it back up, open the forum to any questions you may have. And then if you have questions specific to your property, I could take those one-on-one after we conclude this.
I had just a quick question. When you had your data for overhead versus indirect for reliability purposes, was that data was Key Biscayne specific?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Oh, in terms of the
5 years that you were talking about,
no,
looking back?
That's FPL as a whole looking at networks.
Okay. So it didn't take into account our own old things that don't
Unless
work.
you're part of the data points that were used in that broader analysis, but
Okay.
it is Florida specific.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yes.
If the actual units were 2,000 square feet average rather than 4,000 square feet that you use, would that really affect the overall calculation?
It would a little bit. It would slightly. It might change the average a little bit on these totals, but not by much. You might see the needle shift probably a few, maybe like $10, $20.
I think it was between 12 and 16.
Mm-hmm.
Lady back there.
She had her
Oh.
1 second. 20 or 30 years? These numbers that you have up there, is
These
that assuming
numbers-
a 20 or 30-year payment?
These are 30 years. That's a good question. This is an annual assessment on a 30-year amortization schedule. But one thing else with assessments that I didn't bring up is when you do an assessment, this is fixed. This is constant every year for the 30 years. And again, I'm comparing with millage, where millage it could vary each year based on what the assessed values are, taxable assessed values are in that particular year. Yes.
Yeah, hi. I have a number of questions that I wrote out, but also some that came up with your discussion. The first one is when you did your special assessment evaluation, part of your charge was to also present to the village not only the special benefits that property owners achieve, but the general benefits village-wise. What are those general benefits?
The general benefits. So with utility undergroundings, the general benefit that we usually always identify is the fact that you already have service being provided. That's the general benefit. So then the special benefit is 100% special benefit for undergrounding the improvements.
No. You were your company was specifically charged with, and part of the formulation for determining special assessments is to separate special benefits, which you can charge property owners,
correct,
from general benefits that the village-wide receives when you put a project in place. Are you saying there are no general benefits if none of them are in your formulation?
I am saying with utility undergroundings, the actual undergrounding improvements and putting underground is 100% special benefit.
Okay.
And government properties are being assessed.
Right. Okay. So that's a little bit different than what we heard from another expert early on. What we heard from the other expert is that all of the criteria that you use can, in fact, be considered general benefits as well as special benefits.
I'm not sure that's correct.
That's what I interpreted.
The reason I'm asking,
Tom could,
to respond to your question.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of these properties, which, as you see from his mint color, are zero special benefit to those properties. For whatever the reason and romance, they have been fully undergrounded from the substation to my kitchen. Okay.
Right.
And nonetheless, they, Habib, put a price factor on it, or a contribution factor, which I took to be the equivalent of a general, the general benefit to the community. You could put any number on there, but it was the general benefit to the community of participating in this process, because you're going to get some general benefit out of it, whether it's directly to your home or not, and whether you're happier at the Winn-Dixie or whatever. And I saw that as what you're asking about.
No, it's exactly
general benefit.
Exactly what I'm asking about, because it basically impacts what a special assessment can be given for. If I'm in the mint area, which I'm not, I don't believe the village can impose a special assessment on my property if the only thing I'm receiving is a general benefit. The special assessment laws are very specific for identifying special benefits to property owners, and that's why you were also asked to identify what portion of this cost, I'm just going out of the box now, can be assigned a general benefit to the entire community. So if the assumption is that minted areas receive a benefit, but they're really general benefits, they already have underground wiring, they're going to get one of the general benefits of safety, reliability, and aesthetics, but we're going to special assess them. I believe there is a legal issue with that.
Yeah, I disagree with your point of what you're making, because they are still looped and they still get service from the overhead utilities that are on the west side of the village.
What about the condos?
Yeah, the condos. That's what. So even though they are direct underground to substation, if that substation link, their underground goes out, they still can get service from the other side of the town, or the village, excuse me, and that area is being undergrounded. So that's why they're still benefiting
from reliability. Okay, I could understand that argument, but aesthetically, safety-wise, is a condo in the minted area getting a special benefit safety-wise for their property?
Yeah, and this comes up a lot. And the answer with that is yes, they do, because when we look at special benefits, you're also looking at access to your property. And then therefore, because the village is also getting improvements, then that's also a special benefit to that property because of ingress and egress. So that is very common to utilize in specifically to utility undergroundings that we have used in many other cases. And me personally, I've done about 16 to 17 utility undergrounding assessments.
Right. So, I mean, you're basically saying there are no general benefits.
besides the assessments that are imposed to the government properties and the public agencies, then those are not being assessed to.
Okay, so that's a little bit
properties.
different than what Tom indicated before, that the entire village benefits generally from, I would say, a portion of any one of those three things. But that is not factored into your assessment formulation. That's okay.
Well,
that'll be discussed later
Sure,
by council.
I can make one point with that because I actually worked on that project, and we did identify a general benefit component in the town because there was a couple areas that were undergrounded and they were going to be assessed, and then they pulled out. So then from that standpoint, we identified that as a general benefit, just so it's similar to saying these parcels benefit, but they're using their own separate funding mechanism. And I identified what their benefit was to then be able to say that no one else is paying for that special benefit that's related to them. Because they decided to go on their own.
I didn't read your report because it wasn't available, but I did read other reports. And generally, the three categories that are assigned special benefits initially are broken up as 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 in the formulation, and then each third is acted upon in terms of the EBUs. I guess the answer to the question I'm going to ask you is going to be no, it's not arbitrary, but why isn't that arbitrary? The 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. What makes beautification 1/3 of the cost in total of the $46 million in terms of a special benefit to the property owners and the community?
Sure.
What makes safety a special benefit to the property owners when the safety issue is really focused on tropical storms and hurricanes, which is a general benefit to the entire community, especially during hurricanes when you can't come back unless it's declared safe?
I wouldn't say that the benefit received for safety or improved safety benefits is a general benefit. I would disagree with that because all properties are going to benefit from improved safety from removing the utility lines. I'll just make one more point on that. I presented to the task force many times before today's meeting, and we did talk about many other approaches. The 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 was brought up, and one thing with that is if you break it out 1/3, then you're not saying which one has more weight versus the other. And I would argue that that's to the eye of the beholder because I've seen with other agencies that I worked with undergroundings, one person feels safety is the most important because of the circumstance that happened in their life, where others feel it's safety or it's aesthetics because they want the view. So it varies depending on who you're talking to. However, in our case, we decided we're not doing 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. We're letting the benefit units dictate how the cost should be spread. So based on the number of benefit units that are assigned, which is separate from, the cost, we let that dictate how much gets spread. And when we look at this project being one of the themes is resiliency of the network, based on, I would say that reliability and safety combined is viewed as resiliency of the network because you want safety, you want reliability. And with those two combined, we're right around 70% of the total cost is related to resiliency.
Well, if I have a quick question, I think FPNL, John, you said that you needed the money up front before you start working. Is that correct?
Once we get to the binding cost estimate stage, the money, the CIAC, is paid up front.
And that's the total amount of the project?
Yes, sir.
So my question is, when you borrow money, you have the total amount ahead of time. How does it work with an assessment? So you're supposed to pay everything up front. So when you borrow the $46 million, you have it up front and you pay it. When you do an assessment, you don't have the money up front.
Well, I'll answer, these annual average assessments, this is based on paying back a certain type of debt.
Right.
So then they'll have the money up front because the village could issue debt or get a loan to get that money up front.
Yeah, so we're getting a loan anyway.
And then this is securing those payments over time.
Okay. Right, so it's just a way of paying it back to you. Okay. The only comment I'm going to make, and I appreciate your presentation, I think it's very thorough. Ultimately, I think this project needs to go forward, but in my opinion, if there's something that's going to interfere with it going forward, is this funding mechanism. I think you're going to have so much pushback in the community that it could really threaten the project. That's my only real concern. We've been talking about this for 20 years, and more than 20 years. I think the simpler you make this, the easier it's going to go. At the end of the day, the numbers themselves aren't that different, the monies, but the concept may make it undoable. We'll spend so much time fighting about it.
Thanks.
If I just may.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And thank you for your hard work and presentation. It certainly is detailed. And my concern is, let's say that we actually chose to do this, which I think for our community would be a grave mistake. But if we did, it would set a precedent. And then how could we go through this kind of methodology to analyze the benefits per property for beach renourishment or for pumps to be installed, let's say, on my street, but 2 streets over, maybe theirs is 6 inches higher, but neither of us can get to our streets because it's flooded to get to them. I mean, this level of analysis for each piece of infrastructure, and it's quite a list that we have, I feel it would just paralyze us. So, but perhaps you have some methodology that applies to pumping water from streets and beach renourishment.
No, I haven't done those type of assessments, if there are any. Only other ones I've seen, like stormwater, I've seen, but other than that, I haven't seen any other ones that you mentioned.
Okay, Councilmember Laredo. What I was thinking of doing was having Mr. Bradford speak to the experiences in Palm Beach, and then have council members, if it's all right, start directing questions to the panel. That's all right. Thank you, Hubby.
Thanks. Well, okay, just again for the record, my name is Tom Bradford, and I was the town manager in Palm Beach. And before that, I was the point person for undergrounding in the town of Palm Beach. In order for you to understand all that we went through, I need to give you a little bit of history about undergrounding in the town, because if you get one piece of it in a vacuum, you might walk away with a different conclusion about why we did this or that in one way or the other. For the town, undergrounding actually began in the year 1982. In 1982, the town council voted that every single lateral in town would be buried at the time of new construction. The lateral, for those of you who don't know, is the line that runs from the distribution line to the home, or from the distribution line to the condominium, commercial, etc. And so over time, most of the properties in Palm Beach had the lateral buried. But when the storms of 2004 came along, the people in Palm Beach were, particularly in the single-family homes, they were without power for 3 and sometimes 4 weeks. And as you might imagine, they went absolutely ballistic. And John can attest to that. He probably slaved many hours over that issue. And so the issue suddenly went from a back burner type issue to the front burner, and they wanted immediate action. And as we went along and prepared the cost estimates and all of the work similar to what Andrea and staff has done here, the town council realized, oh my gosh, we also have these humongous infrastructure issues that we have to address. We had an ancient storm water system. We had an ancient sanitary sewer system. We needed numerous pump station upgrades on the island, which are on the west edge of the island into the Lake Worth Lagoon. And it ended up being over, well, about $100 million. So they said to staff, put that aside and let us do the bond issues for that. And when they did that, certain of the wealthier communities in town, neighborhoods, came to them and said, wait a minute, we don't want to wait. We're tired of waiting. What can you do for us? We want to go forward now. And, of course, they had bigger fish to fry, and that was to deal with the infrastructure issues that I mentioned earlier. So what they devised was, hey, we can do a neighborhood or a condominium or a commercial area, whatever the case may be. We can do that using a special assessment, and that way that neighborhood gets what they want, but the rest of the town doesn't have to pay because we have these other issues to do. So they created what we called the Neighborhood Assessment Program, and off we went. I had to go and deal with the people and get the signatures. We had a whole process for that to show for the approval of assessments. We did Everglades Island. We did Lake Towers Condominium. We did Nightingale Trail and La Puerta Way. And others, I forget now that I'm retired. I can't remember as like I used to. But we did a number of neighborhoods using special assessments. So it got to the point when we had more hurricanes, people, the elected officials said, hey, let's just do the whole town. This is ridiculous. We've got to do something about this. The outages and by the way, I want to mention this. We were averaging one serious fire per week in the rear yards of the single-family homes. The landscaping would be, tossed in the wind. It would cause the arcing and the sparks and the fires. And so that was a safety issue above and beyond crashing into a pole or the pole crashing into you. People were fearful of the impact of the fires that were happening in the town of Palm Beach. So they wanted something done, and they decided that, hey, the best way to deal with the fact that we had these neighborhoods that had already been assessed was to use assessments townwide, and that way the neighborhoods who already had been assessed using basically the same methodology that we proposed for the entire town, that they wouldn't have to pay twice. So that's the history of how we ended up doing assessments, which is very important. One other thing I want to say about assessments before I move on. There's something that's very important about assessments that I haven't heard anybody talk about. You can prepay an assessment. You cannot prepay millage rates. And in Palm Beach, the prepayment was extremely popular. I think within the first 3 months of the timeline that we had for the prepayment, we received over $13 million just in prepayments. So people like that aspect, and that project in Palm Beach is a lot more expensive. We borrowed $90 million. The original budget was $98.6 million. Today, I believe it's $103 million. So we're talking about much bigger numbers than what you folks are dealing with here. So they liked the assessments because it was a truer cost of actually providing it yourself, and it had no bearing relative to the value of your property. There was a home, to give you one example, on South Ocean Boulevard in Palm Beach, where the man who owned it came up to me after a presentation I made, and he said, Mr. Bradford, I did the math, and I'm going to pay over 30 years, I'm going to pay $300,000 for you to underground my house. And that's when I first realized, that the millage rate is not a panacea. There are a lot of circumstances where it's not really fair based upon what it really costs to provide for undergrounding. But anyway, we had the town council, from their perspective, they wanted their cake and eat it too. By that I mean they wanted the assessments, which was a hard sell in certain parts of the community. In our case, it was the condominiums that were not in favor of the assessments. And the single-family homeowners were in favor. But keep in mind, the average single-family home median value in Palm Beach is just under $4 million, and your average, your median value is $1.2 million. So we're talking about, numbers that can be double what you're talking about. So when I say cake and eat it too, what I meant is they wanted the lowest cost of interest as well as the assessments. And so we had to do a general obligation bond that made it clear to the voter that we were going to borrow this money, and if for some reason assessments failed or any other repayment process failed, we could use the full faith and credit of the town to repay that debt, meaning we would put it on the tax bill and they would pay it as the fallback. So you get the lowest cost of interest when you use general obligation bonds. I had to go out and sell it to the community and, neighborhood meetings and condo meetings. And fortunately, depending on your point of view, it only passed by 65 votes, but it passed. And we were sued within 30 days of it passing. They challenged the methodology. They challenged everything you can think of. And we won. So far, we have won every single case because the detail, in fact, your detail that Habib has described here tonight is much, much better than the assessments that he did for us. The differentiation between the nuances between the properties is so spectacular. I can't envision a judge turning down and denying the adequacy of the methodology. But anyway, they did it. And off we went to the races. We did the master plan. We also used Kimley Horn. We implemented the assessments, which actually we did that before the referendum. And I think that now we have 8 phases. We've just finished the first phase. They're switching over now eventually to remove the poles in the backyards, and they're systematically marching through the town, removing the overhead utilities. And the one thing that I think is very important for everybody, particularly the decision makers here tonight, is most of the citizens, they look to you to tell them, remember, it's a representative form of government. They look to you to tell them what you think is the best thing to do for your community. And what I found in my own experience is once that Palm Beach made the decision, once the referendum passed, and off we went, people surprised me, and they became teammates. They worked with us to help us. There's always a difficult person. There's always that. That's whether it's business or government, you always have that. There's nothing unusual there. But for the most part, people work with us to find a place to put that transformer on their property. We were flexible. We would work. It could be on this corner, that corner. We'll landscape it, do all of this stuff. But by and large, the animosity and the aggravation is over. My advice to all of you, based on my own experience, is get this thing going while the interest rates are low. You can do commercial paper, which we did. The rates, I looked at it the other day, the rates are still under 2% for commercial paper. And you use that as your bridge financing. And then once you've finished this project and you know the totality of the cost, finance it. I don't care whether you use revenue bonds or general obligation bonds. You're talking like 20 basis points difference between the two. It's not a big deal. But once you've made that decision, go for it. Finance it at the best rate you can. If you think you need to do a GO, put it to the people after you've already gotten that far. Right now, the most important thing is get going because construction prices are rising and no one knows how long you're going to have this beautiful market for the borrowing of interest, of money. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. To be clear, the lawsuits were filed by condominiums who wanted to pay zero, or who was filing the lawsuits?
It was filed by individuals who, most of the attacks were that the methodology was unfair. That was one. We had a couple of those. Unfair to all people, that it was not based on a rational nexus between cost and benefit and all that, and it was upheld by the courts. as was Gulfstream as well. And then we had an attack relative to the ballot language itself was misleading, that it was not clear, that they were going to have assessments with it. The judge, he just threw that out because he realized when you read the ballot, it says the assessments would be involved. So they challenged it, those, the methodology of the assessments and the transparency, if you will, of the ballot language itself.
But it came from both single-family homeowners and condo owners?
Yes, we did get that from both. That's correct.
Okay. Councilmember Laredo?
Yeah, I just wonder if, thank God that, I know I don't speak for Ed London, but that we got at least two gentlemen who've actually done it, because we've been anxious to talk to non-consultants. I assume you're here as an individual and not as a consultant.
Gratis. Yeah. Gratis.
And I think I speak for everybody to thank you for the time. It's not an easy to come up here, but we're hungry. At least I'm hungry for the actual work and not abroad. This requires yes or no answer. I guess you already did. You do believe forcefully on undergrounding, on balance, and you have it's a good thing.
Yes, sir. I do. And that started when I was in college, and I live in a neighborhood that's undergrounded. I've seen the faster turnaround in my own circumstances for restoration of power post-storm, and from aesthetic point of view and safety point of view, it's the way to go.
The second question is because the only thing I admire about myself is that I know what I don't know. You lost me there for a minute, whether you are supporting special assessment or be on the general text.
I think that there's no wrong way to do the allocation of cost. Most citizens...
Can you use the mic, please?
Most citizens are familiar with millage rates and property values. It's something that they've known their whole adult life. The assessments may be confusing to some of them, but that doesn't make it wrong or a bad thing. It can actually be a more fair way of doing it, but at the end of the day, you and your colleagues have to do what you think.
So you must be a lawyer, because you're not giving me a yes.
No.
You're not giving me a yes or no answer. I take it. I take it.
There's no clear answer.
I understand.
Yes.
I was confused when your answer about whether you were proposing a special assessment.
I just want to add to that question, because maybe the question that you're asking is not the right one. I think the question is, if you were to do the project in Town Beach again, would you do a special assessment or would you go millage rate?
Well, Mr. Moss, if it was my decision to make, as opposed to being the town manager and having to implement the decision of the elected officials, I probably, knowing what I know today, I probably would have gone the millage route instead of the assessment route, because there were many less people who were concerned about millage than there were the number who were concerned about assessments. That would have just made my life easier in my selling of it and having to live with the consequences of a large body of people not having been satisfied with the way that we charged for it. But again, it wasn't my decision. But yeah, if I was king and I did it again, I'd go millage rate, because most people know it and understand it.
Don? I guess I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
And I've been very reluctant to raise this for a long, long time, but I don't think we should leave here tonight without the issue coming up. And you handled it very interestingly. You said that when you went to this assessment process, what you were trying to do was to exclude those parts of the city that had already done that through other assessments. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And the issue was you did not want to double dip.
That's correct.
Now, I'm not certain how this community really is going to play this, but I think there's a little drone hanging over here that hasn't been fully explained to everybody, and I'm going to take a minute to do that. The mint area, okay? Is that on the chart? The mint area?
Oh, the color mint, yes.
Yeah, which are the undergrounded, essentially the undergrounded condos on the east side of Crandon that were built somewhere over the last 50 years, 49 years.
Mm-hmm.
And there are 5 or 6 very large condos, for example, that have been fully undergrounded since they were built between 1970 and 2000, whatever. It has been my understanding, that the undergrounding costs, all right, were underwritten or assumed by the developers. And so that the cost of that undergrounding ultimately passed to the initial owner, who had to pay for whatever that was, including the rest of the construction costs. Okay? So the question has kept coming back, and Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, that the question has been raised by those condo owners now, who may be the relatives as I am, or some are the same people who were there forever. If you do a straight millage rate, whatever that cost is, am I not paying double because I am paying effectively for an undergrounding that I already have? And the issue of fairness and equity has come up, and it's going to come up to the council one way or another, as to how do you deal with the fact that half the population, or at least half of the village more or less, has already paid their money for this undergrounding. It was not the village's money. It was not a village assessment or appropriation. It was not the village that paid for it. Now, if that's not correct, if the village actually paid for all this, I would really like to know. But for several years now, I've been unable to find out that this undergrounding was paid for by anybody but the developers and then passed on to the owners. And that's the, how shall I put it, the fairness question of how do you accommodate for the fact that that has already been paid for by 4,000 of the units or so forth.
Yes.
And that's I want to pose it not because I have any answer, but that this has been hanging out there, and everybody and all of my good friends who've written the editorials in the last week have not taken into account that the people in the other boat already paid for the plug in the boat with their money, not with your money. And that's where I really feel that somewhere along the line that has to be explored by somebody.
Well, I'll give you my 2 cents. It's not going to cover all the legal issues relative to that, but I'll touch on it as much as I can. If you go the millage route, then you can definitely know up front you're not going to find a way to make anything better for those who have already converted to underground. It's just not doable. It's based on the value of your property, and it is what it is. Now, you can argue that even some people have argued that a property that has undergrounding is more valuable than one that does not, and so therefore they pay more in taxes. But putting that aside, if you use millage, you can't do anything. Habib's assessment has already taken that into account based on what I heard him say tonight. If they are already undergrounded, they're getting a reduced assessment.
Correct, and that's the whole point of
right.
what Habib did.
Now, in the case of Palm Beach, it was only related to those who had done the assessment methodology that was very similar, if not exactly like that which they did for the entire town. But in your example you gave with the Mint areas east of Crandon, if you go millage, you can't do anything. And by the way, there are numerous single-family homes, and I would imagine commercial properties as well, where they just, out of their pocket, that homeowner buried it for whatever reason. They didn't like seeing the line going through their backyard when they walked out onto the front porch, or back porch. They paid that, but there's no way, unless you use an assessment, to give them an offset.
Okay. Now, I'm not suggesting that by my statement that I am wedded to anything as a task force member,
Right.
Other than moving this forward. But I feel that for the benefit of the people from the community here, that it's a fact and a piece of information that needs to be taken into account in the what I'll call political consideration of how do you resolve this on behalf of the entire community.
Right.
Because these are people in the community as well.
Tom, I have a
Thank you.
question. The exempt properties, taxpayers' properties, how was handled in Palm Beach?
Everybody paid. Everyone pays. The churches paid. The town of Palm Beach itself had an assessment for $2.5 million. We had to pay. We paid cash. We prepaid as well. Everybody, churches, synagogues, everybody pays. Museums, you name it. Nonprofits, they all paid. School board is exempt by law. Yes, sir.
Wait, hold on. Ed, sorry.
To answer Don's question or Don's statement regarding that everybody paid for it originally because the developers charged them for it and the price they charged for the condominium. Unfortunately for developers, they charge what the market will bear. If the market's good, they charge more. If the market's bad, they charge less. So they don't make a profit, they lose money. So there's no direct correlation, in my opinion, between what the cost of undergrounding was. And also, we don't know what happened, say, 40 years ago when, say, the towers at Key Biscayne, or 50 years ago when some of these other buildings were built, what their deal was with FP&L, because at that time, FP&L had no wires or excuse me, or feeders down for those systems. So I don't know if they got some credit back then for FP&L not doing it, or it was a contract deal with FP&L when they put the deal in. So I don't know that you can make the statement, Don. Again, maybe you're right, but I don't really make the statement that everybody paid for it because the developer paid for it and he just passed it on. Developer charged what he could, period.
Fair enough. Like I said, I don't consider this gospel.
I also,
Yeah, that was.
oh, sorry, yeah.
Okay, I yield to Pat.
No, regarding that question, because I'm aware of that, and it is a sticky question, but property value and what goes into it, it's hard, how do you isolate, undergrounded lines when there's so many other factors in property value? And even if you could isolate it, any amenity or improvement, the cost of it is eventually amortizing it over a number of years. It doesn't go on forever. At some point, that has been paid. So I'd love to have other deeper understanding of it, but that was my take on it.
Now, as to fairness, which he talked about, I think that the feedback that you're getting from the public and former elected officials, which is this intangible, which is called the Key Biscayne spirit, because we fought very hard to create this village, unlike the town of Palm Beach, which is always a jewel in the East Coast. And so there is that a very valuable, which cannot fit into any of those charts, of the dream, the spirit of the dream. And we have stayed away from single-member districts. We push back on other things like committees that have to be represented because we want to be one. And so I want you I want to rephrase or reaffirm what other colleagues with a lot more experience have said. And that is a very compelling argument and a very valuable argument.
It is.
It's a very valuable argument because
and
we pay for this quality of your life.
I believe that it is very important, and you should do what you think is best.
Yes.
There's no, in
No,
my
I
mind,
am very delighted of your frankness. I am happy as can be since you got the microphone. Now, excuse me, Mayor, let me finish. The FPNL, one of the benefits of retirement is that he can be more frank. You being on the staff and the payroll, senior executive, you would not want to answer. Would you venture to answer without any binding that would you recommend that we go, let's put aside the payment sector, that we go undergrounding? Because I want to cross at least one bridge, that we invest in undergrounding, given the pluses and minuses that you are giving us, reliability, flooding, all of that. But in general, would you, if not, it's okay.
No, again, we're, like I said, we're an overhead company today. But again, moving forward, I guess the more that is underground, the more you're going to be reliable, okay? And I think you'll see in the future at Florida Power and Light, in the coming years, we're going to get to that point where more and more that we do is going to be underground. And whether it's, we have the assessment today of 25%, the 25% may increase. So in that case, we're trying to encourage more communities to go underground.
All right, and for the benefit of my fellow elected officials, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a prominent bill being introduced in the legislature. I forget the name of the senator, which is going to take up the issue that was there 25 years ago about mandating some sort of formula to FPNL to spread the cost across the state. You're not in public affairs, I know, but that is something that we need to talk about also about our legislative priorities, because that's already been formally introduced. But I appreciate your comment. So the industry trend, for the reasons it's in this direction, independent of now the big discussion, which is how to pay for it. Thank you both.
In response to the comments that Don Ellisberg made, it's my understanding that when Fritz Scherenberg decided to build Key Colony, for example, Key Colony was a golf course. And so he asked and worked out a deal with Florida Power and Light to underground power to the property. And he considered that a value added to the property and to his ability to sell reliable power to the condominiums. And that was part of his sales pitch, that it was undergrounded. Living in Key Colony, I can tell you that power goes down, and I hear, through chats, that large parts of the village are down for hours and hours and hours, and Key Colony is back, boom, like that. We go down for a few minutes and we're right back up. So the reliability, I've lived it. I don't know whether or not we have some power coming from above and then going underground, or it comes directly underground from the substation. But I can tell you that when power goes down, it comes back very, very fast. We're one of the first complexes on the island to get power back after a hurricane. So to me, I'm convinced that undergrounding is going to be a huge benefit to everybody in the community. The issue of how we pay for it, I like this concept of the assessment. I think we get better buy-in with it. It looks more equitable. It looks fair. It's easier to explain to people, I think, combined with what you mentioned of taking advantage of low interest rates and finding a financing mechanism that can dovetail with the special assessment. I think would be very interesting. Thank you. Stephen.
Yes, I understand that this is the workshop for the undergrounding committee and project, but I'm also wondering whether we are not looking at the bigger picture. We're talking about underground financing. That's just one of the many components that we need to talk about when it comes to the 2040 and the resilience plan. And what are the other elements that we need to consider and finance? And shouldn't we look at those things first, understand how much money approximately we will need in the next, whatever, 10, 20, 30 years, and start on that level before we go into the minutia of things like this. Also, Key Biscayne, since it was incorporated in 1991, has never done a project not through capital improvement funding. And I don't understand why at all of a sudden we're now looking at other forms of financing project of this size and this importance, basically saying we're going to special assess per small project. Oh, I guess I'm out of battery. And when it comes to special assessment, I think you've done a great job in explaining how equitable you wanted to make it. But are we going to start looking at how many times the condo owners are going to use their specific piece of road? How many people go to Winn-Dixie versus the Golden Hog, and how much usage our infrastructure is getting? How many people are using the park or not? I mean, at what point are we going to stop looking at the incremental minute assessment of our island's usage and infrastructure usage, and not look at what kind of community do we want to be? I mean, do we want to be one community that is making room for all these different uses and all different people, no matter where they live, or what kind of community do we want to be? I mean, I think those are questions we need to answer first.
Yeah, I just want to make one other point. I went through the approach, the methodology. There's a lot of formulas to assign benefit units, but the one thing I didn't mention was because we're letting the benefit units allocate the cost, at the very end, what it comes down to, if you want to make it very, very simple, you look at your parcel, you sum up the total benefit units of all three categories, and then you multiply it by the assessment rate. Right now, it's $528. So in terms of explaining it to somebody, if they just look at their total benefit units that got assigned to them, multiply it by $528, that's their charge for the annual assessment. Correct.
Yeah, just comment about the Florida League of Cities survey in 2017. I just want to make sure the village council is aware of it. Manager is. I don't know if the task force is, but there was a survey of 412 municipalities, 36% responded to it. And, the statistics are statistics. They could be interpreted different ways. But one thing that popped out to me was the method of financing of the 147 cities that responded. And this is about retrofitting underground. 8% said it was paid through bonding or a revenue stream. I'm not sure what that means. But then it was retrofitting was paid for dollars from the municipality as it became available. That was at 38%. 8% was done via special assessment. And there were 46% of non-responders to that question. Golden Beach, Sunny Isles, I've done some research today. They have done underground wiring, and they have done it through GEOs. I'm trying to get in touch with Treasure Island. I don't know what municipalities the task force has looked at and has presented to the council as to what municipalities have done special assessments or what have done GOs. But I think that's an important information that the council has to get in order to make a decision. So.
We did look at specifically in putting this thing together at Longboat Key as another alternative that was doing it. We knew that Palm Beach was doing it, and our assorted consultants, councilman, were provided other numerous names of where it was being done. And I noticed in the business news or whatever that they published in Miami this week is a story about the city of Miami Beach doing a special assessment for underground utilities in 3 different areas. That they're, I forget what parts of the 3 pieces of Miami Beach are undergoing the process that we are either starting or finishing. I'm not sure where they are, but to do the special assessment for the utilities.
I just wanted to address some of the questions about why we looked into this at all, having been someone who voted to approve this money to explore this option. I can explain where my head was. I definitely see this as one step in a very long journey of preparing this island in terms of preparation for sea level rise. Unfortunately, we're looking at it as one project because of the timeline imposed on us by FPL. So when we were looking at it, we felt, Palm Beach was very similar. This is the way they did it. We had residents coming in asking that we consider it, so we did. And I'm hearing tonight really interesting things that I didn't know about what led Palm Beach to that decision. I'm also hearing from many more residents that this is not the way they want to see things going. So I think it's important that we're all taking in all of this information when we're making our decision. But I also think it's essential that we get the kind of participation that we've had tonight and that all voices are heard. I, for one, definitely see this as one island, and I see it as one project of others. I don't know that we can bond out an unknown number for projects not yet identified, but I think we're all in this. We're in this together, and what led me down the road to look for special assessment has been clarified that it's not for me. It's what I'm hearing now, but it's something I think the council needs to look at more, and certainly that I will continue studying. Thank you.
Michelle, want to make some final comments?
Well, I think that she said exactly what I was having in mind to say. Anyone from the panel have last word, some comments or something that you'd like to say now and give us some more advice? Okay, I think that has been very constructive. Our work from the task force is almost done, accomplished. I think that we have done the best that we could have for this evening and to bring the panelists that they have helped us all the way. Was not an easy task. I am not going to repeat what Councilman McCartney said was exactly what we decided at the beginning. We have an estimated number from the wish list for $110 million. When we saw that number, we say, wait a minute, what is the timeline we have with each of these projects? So the underground for the power lines have a deadline. So that's why when we decided to concentrate on that task, because the rest can come along. But everything, I think, have to be looked at by the council and make the decision. If it's a magic number of $110 million, will be the council decision to decide which route they're going to go. But the task force is all for the undergrounding. And as a direct beneficiary for years on the island, having underground is fantastic. Really, in the last storm we all lived through, the power, the underground, certain areas was no more than 1 day that they have the power back. Commercial side and residentials took them a week. And that is the benefit that all island we have. I think that all of us, we need our supermarket, we need our medical center, we need everything that is in the commercial side. So with that said, I would like to have you continue to come and participate in the meetings. There are large more items to be discussed and to come. And please continue to be involved. Continue to let the council know from now on what is your vision and what you like to see for not only for underground. So if that's it, I would like to thank everybody for coming and participating this evening.
I was going to say the same thing. I'll roll through it. I want to thank our panel for coming. Thank you, Andrea, for putting this all together, well, working with everybody to put it together. Thank you all. Look, we've got it on the agenda. I put a discussion item for next Tuesday. We will be talking about the financing. We'll be sort of going over a lot of what we talked about tonight. So we'd appreciate. Look, this is the kind of input. These are the issues this community's been great about. I mean, we talk about them. Sometimes we fight about them, but we always come to a good decision for this community. So keep at it. Stay involved. But really, thank you all, and thank you to this task force. These folks have dedicated a lot of time to this. This is it's a lot, and I know a lot of them didn't realize that they were going to be stepping into what they were stepping into. Do you want to join the sure underground utilities? How tough can that be? But thank you all, and thanks all for coming. Take care.